Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this meeting of the Budget and Finance Committee for Monday, October 29th, 2012. I'm Paul Krikorian, Chair of the committee, and I'm joined by my colleagues, Councilmember Mitch Englander, Councilmember Paul Kretz, and Councilmember Bill Rosendahl. Thank you all for making it here today. There are two items on today's agenda. We'll be taking general public comment before we begin our agenda items. So as of right now, at 2:15, I have no cards for general public comment. If there's anybody who is planning to submit general public comment not on an agenda item, please raise your hand. Seeing none, general public comment is closed. That brings us to item 1 on the agenda, and I'd like to call Mr. Santana forward. Item number 1.
Item number 1 is a City Administrative Officer report relative to a Moody's Investor Service Rating Action Report.
Welcome.
Thank you. Miguel Santana, CAO. Good afternoon. Item number 1 pertains to a communication on a report issued by Moody's on October 9th. This assessment comes after a review of 32 cities throughout California, and specifically as a result of the recent bankruptcy announcements by Stockton and San Bernardino and other cities that have been going through financial difficulty. Specifically, Moody's looked at 32 cities throughout the state and downgraded the city of Los Angeles, specifically on general obligation bonds, from A1 to A2 with the stable judgment obligation bonds. What this means is that, and
I'm sorry, Mr. Santana, forgive me, I'm going to interrupt you for 1 second because we have a tremendous outpouring of interest in today's meeting, and there's a lot of people who are standing in the back of the room. We have a full house. I just wanted to let you know that there is overflow seating in 1020, which is right next door, and we have a feed in there as well, I think, right? We have sound in there, so you'll be able to follow the proceedings. Then when we come to that item, you'll be able to come back in here. So if you want to take a seat, there's seating available in 1020. Sorry, go ahead, Mr. Santana.
No problem. What this means is that they're specifically concerned about the status of our general fund. And so judgment obligation bonds are supported by the general fund. And as a result of the current state of the general fund, and specifically our forecasted shortfalls for the next few years, they felt that a lower rating was necessary. On the good news is that we are being currently reviewed along with San Francisco for a potential upgrade in relation to general obligation bonds, which are supported specifically by property taxes. San Francisco and Los Angeles have actually been two cities that have experienced stable property tax revenues. Our collections on property taxes are very high, somewhere in the 98% level. And we didn't experience the dramatic drop in property values like some of the neighboring counties, particularly in the east of us, like San Bernardino, Riverside. We haven't received an upgrade, but we were informed by Moody's that there is a potential for an upgrade on any bond, on specifically general obligation bonds that are supported by property taxes. The biggest takeaway out of all of this is, of course, that there continues to be concern regarding the state of our general fund. We are only 2 notches away from going down to the B category, which is a level of concern. And so it emphasizes yet again the context in which we're operating in, where we're closely being monitored as it relates to the status of the general fund. So I have with me Natalie Brill, who's in charge of debt and for the city. We'll be happy to answer any questions. We released an article in the Bond Buyer that appeared last week that really summarizes a lot of these issues. I know they're rather complex, but they did a good job in sort of articulating the state of our general fund and all the issues around that.
Good afternoon. Do you want to add anything? All right. Members, questions? Mr. Englander.
Yeah, can you walk us through the GO ratings as well on the GEO bonds? Did they weigh in on those? Because I know that we've heard in the past that they've said, Moody's has said that they've been impressed with some of the things we've done and demonstrated at least some more financial sound principles as far as the GEO bonds. But did they weigh in on those on this report as well?
Yeah, specifically on the general obligation bonds, those are bonds that are supported by property tax assessment. So property taxes in Los Angeles have been stable. They only declined in 1 year during the height of the bust that occurred a few years ago, and have slowly been increasing. Part of the issue is that because of Prop 13, there's still a gap between the assessed value of a home and the actual value of it. And so regardless of the fluctuations in the market with home prices, most homes are still assessed at a stable level, didn't experience the same kind of drop. In terms of our overall discussion with the bond rating agencies on the decisions being made here in Los Angeles, they have obviously been looking at our various actions carefully, but in light of the recent bankruptcy announcements throughout the state, we've been put on a much closer leash, if you will, in terms of the kind of actions that they're looking for. The recent action around pension reform, I think, will be received well because they have cited our concerns around pensions as being an ongoing issue. Our ability to continue to reduce the general fund deficit from what was over $1 billion 3 years ago now to $220 million or so. All of those things are noticed. But the fact that we still have a deficit, the fact that our options becoming less and less, contributed to this actual downgrade that we received.
And then real quick on that, on the general obligation bonds, and thank you, Mr. Chair, for putting this item first before we get into the discussions of the FSR, and I think it's important. A lot of people don't necessarily follow what our bond rating agencies do to us and for us, and what those impacts mean. And if you could just take a minute to express why they are so connected, why it's so important. You mentioned at the beginning of your presentation that we're just 2 steps away from going into a B rating. How does that affect our entire financial situation with all of these, what we're going to get into in the next item, of all of these severe potential cuts? Why are they married? And if you could walk us through a little bit of that.
Sure. I mean, in simple terms, our bond rating is much like our FICO score, which is, anyone who's borrowed money to buy a car or to buy a home knows that score is important. And the reason it's important because it determines the kind of interest rate you will be paying. And so, obviously, as our ratings decline, then the direct correlation with that is that we end up paying more in interest rates, which means to borrow money, which the city does on a regular basis, it becomes more expensive. So dollars that should be going to services and protecting jobs in the city get then sent to banks in form of interest rates. So our bond rating is important because it allows us to make a credible case to investors and to banks that we're in sound financial footing, which then results in lower interest rates, which then saves us money to invest back into services.
Is it easy enough to just simply state or quantify how much, for an example, a year, just one step in the downgrade could potentially cost us?
It depends on what bond we're issuing, but it ranges in the millions of dollars differences. And, the rating is one piece of what we get evaluated in. How the market's doing as a whole is another. And, of course, the nature of the bond, what we're borrowing for, also impacts it. One of the things that I think most of my colleagues around the state and throughout the country recognize is that the context of the fiscal crisis that we're in is not unique to Los Angeles. It's being experienced all over the state and all over the country. We all agree that as in the next 24 months, that it's going to be probably more difficult to borrow money because of that. So as more cities file for bankruptcies or more cities get to that point, then investors are going to become more and more concerned about purchasing municipal bonds in the future. So, but at the end, it has a financial impact for the city.
Mr. Rosendahl.
Yes, good afternoon.
Good seeing you.
A couple of good questions here. You know, in the past, you might not know this, but I was the chair of the taxing policy for the new economy. We held 17 hearings across the state. It was not Democrat or Republican. It was driven by the need of how do we take Prop 13 day, but bring ourselves into the new day where we're at. You've heard me use the expression gold in the gutter. Well, it was very clear to me that businesses that have moved in are paying their fair share, but businesses that have been there since Prop 13 are not. I was told by the people who worked with me there was $5 to $7 billion there. Well, you know, it was Gray Davis who made me chair. It was approved by the legislature, and he picked the rest of the committee. And then Arnold comes in, Gray's out, and I give the final report to Arnold. And I said, this could give you a roadmap for success. Arnold's in, Arnold's out. Along comes Gray Davis. Not Gray Davis, I'm sorry. Jerry Brown. And there I said, Jerry, for God's sake, look at the gold in the gutter. He handed it over to one of his deputies, but he didn't get back to me. So I'm just curious, has any of this report I did, that 17 hearings, and we were really serious what we did. We were nonpartisan. I was a cable executive. I wasn't into politics from that level. Have you heard anything from them, or is there anything you can do or we can do to see if we, in fact, can make the businesses that have been there pay their fair share, especially if you're a business across the street that's paying your fair share?
I'm somewhat familiar with the work that you did. I was monitoring it when I was at the county, and it was probably one of the most comprehensive analysis of our tax structure and tried to sort of remedy a lot of the lack of alignment that exists and fairness that exists throughout the state. I have not heard of it being brought back for further discussion. But we could certainly find out if there's been added interest to try to resurrect many of those recommendations that you've issued, and we could report back on that.
I would love that, and I'd like to formally, if the chair would agree, make it a motion from this committee to look into that and see if there is that money that we could get, or at least get them to respond to the city of Los Angeles. Could I have
Right.
a motion on that? Anybody?
Sure.
Motion?
So you would like that for consideration for, separate from this report, separate from what we're hearing today, for a future
As
consideration in this
potential revenue
committee?
that I believe we should be getting.
Always happy to hear about additional potential revenue, Mr. Rosendahl, so that would be fine.
Unanimous? Oh,
It seems so. Mr. Kretz?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, when has this happened before in terms of a downgrade in the city's history, and what was the resulting impact?
The last downgrades we experienced were following the height of our fiscal crisis 2 years ago, if you recall. In that context, it was a result of the response to the debate that was occurring around the transfer with DWP. And the direct result is that when we actually issued the TRAN, we only got four investors who participated in the TRAN, which was an unusually low number of investors. And the less investors you receive, the higher you pay in interest, which we did. We've been successful in sharing our story to investors and to the market since then, and so we've done better, but it took us about 1.5 years to recover from that downgrade. And so that's a good example of a direct correlation between the downgrade and the difficulty in us settling bonds.
Do we know what the net loss was? How much more did it cost us because of that?
Yeah, I think we're thinking about a few $1 million.
I
Because
think we lost about 20 or 25 basis points. Most of the state was around between 50 and 60. I think we ended up paying close to 80, no, on the last two issuance. So it was,
So that cost us, what do we think in terms of actual
probably
dollars?
a couple of, it was 1.2 billion, so probably about $2 million, $2-3 million.
Thank you.
So thank you for, again, highlighting to all of us the great sensitivity that our city's budget has to credit ratings and the importance of continuing to demonstrate fiscal responsibility and restraint in order to preserve those credit ratings, because that has a real dollars and cents impact on what we have available to us. And I think, as Mr. Englander well pointed out, the progress that we've made so far, I think, has paid dividends in our credit rating status, but clearly we, like all other cities, have a ways to go before we're done with this. I do just want to note that as I read the report, and correct me if I'm wrong, on the general obligation bond downgrade, Moody's analysis was based on cities in California generally. There was no specific analysis done of Los Angeles's exposure to potential liability, right? I mean, there was no analysis of particular cases or likelihood of outcomes, nothing like that. This downgrade was entirely due to economic conditions in California as a whole.
That is correct. What prompted it was obviously what was happening throughout the state. The analysis came after they submitted to us a couple dozen very specific questions on Los Angeles. So I think it was maybe 3 months ago that I mentioned the fact that Moody's had asked us a whole series of questions in response to what was going on in San Bernardino.
Right.
And we try to distinguish ourselves in that context from other jurisdictions that are facing greater difficulty. But you're correct that the analysis was prompted by what has been occurring throughout the state.
They did the same thing, but they did more of an analysis of city by city. They did one of California, and all they didn't do any downgrades or upgrades. They just did an analysis of city and kept our bond the same.
On GOs or judgment
On
obligations?
everything, on all our debt
Okay.
portfolio. But there was
okay.
no, but this one was, they just took everything and put it together. We don't know why.
Right. My point with this is that the downgrade is on, and thank you for correcting me, Mr. Englander, I misspoke. I meant to say judgment
Yeah.
obligation bonds.
Right.
There was no assessment of the potential liability of the city on particular judgments, the trends that we have on
That's correct.
judgments, nothing
Yeah,
like
that
that.
is
This
correct.
was entirely due to economic, larger sort of macroeconomic
That is right.
circumstances, and that on the JO and the GO, they talked to you privately,
Right.
about the factors that could influence our future health, and they are continued economic weakening broadly, revenues failing to keep pace with our growth in expenditures, and declines in the reserve fund,
That's right.
as being the three big things. Okay, that's important, I think, as a prelude to our next conversation as well. So thank you very much. We have one card on item number 1, and that's Noel Weiss. Thank you. Mr. Weiss.
Members of the committee, this relates to Moody's downgrade of the city. I think relative to the issue on the judgment bonds, because apparently that's where they're looking to downgrade, I really haven't seen any kind of detailed analysis of the nature and the extent to which the city adequately, competently deals with these issues of judgment. I think there's only been a couple of instances in the past, 4 or 5 years, the dog food situation comes to light, where the city council actually said, no, you know what, we're not going to take this settlement. And I understand issues relative to police and things of that nature, but I think there needs to be a better study and evaluation of why it is that the city council in closed session goes ahead and pretty much approves almost all of these settlements. And that necessarily shouldn't be the case. Also, audits inefficiency. I really haven't seen any decent recommendations on risk analysis, which leads directly to judgments against the city. What kind of risk analysis do we really undertake in the Budgets and Audits Committee? And what kinds of recommendations can this committee seek and elicit by way of controlling the city's risk? And frankly, maybe that means rewarding employees. Maybe that means having a competent whistleblower protection law, so we really get at fraud, abuse, and waste, so that employees who want to basically stick their neck out aren't going to get canned and aren't going to get their heads chopped off, and in effect are going to get rewarded. Things of that nature, a little bit more imaginative, that maybe we can get at the blood and guts of some of these risks that the city confronts and yet never seems to be able to overcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Just brief response, Mr. Weiss, to the assumption that the council approves all settlements. That clearly is not the case. Every settlement comes before the claims board first, then it comes before this committee, and then only after those two steps does it go before the council. And in both of those preceding steps, there's a robust discussion that very often leads in settlement proposals being turned down. So we look very closely at those things. All right, so that brings us to item number 2. And I think given the large number of folks here, I'm inclined to allow the public to speak before we have discussions, just so that everybody can say with it. And I see a few nodding heads, so I think that's the way we should probably go, just so that people can have their say. And we've got a lot of cards.
Mr. Chair, just a
Mr. Roosevelt.
privilege, and obviously the democracy is what I believe in tremendously. If they begin to repeat themselves, is it possible to ask some of them what he said or she said makes sense to me, and ditto, or do they all feel they have to have a minute or whatever? I'm just curious if, I want to hear the issue clear, and I'd like people to admit to it, just like I did the other day when the SEIU came in with 1 million people, and they all had public comment cards. I had 2 of their leaders speak, and if anybody else wanted to speak, they could. So just wondering if we can help the clock, because I have to leave at a certain point.
Okay. Yeah, as is always the case, keep in mind, folks, that, we do have limited amount of time, but obviously everybody's entitled to have their say. But if it is repetitive, you're free to just say you absolutely agree with the previous speaker or whatever else. So here's what I want to do, I think. Let's before we hear the full report on the FSR, our city attorney is here, so I'd like to afford him the opportunity. It's up to you, Mr. City Attorney, if you'd like to speak now, or if you would prefer to hear the report and then speak. I want to be deferential to your time. So
Comments are going to be the same either way.
okay, all right. Well then, if you'd like, why don't we start with our city attorney first?
So this is item 2, and it's the CEO report relative to the first financial status report.
And then what I think we'll do after the city attorney speaks, we'll have the members specify which departments you are going to have questions about on the FSR, and then if there are departments who are represented here that there isn't going to be any discussion about among the members, we'll be able to release them to go ahead and go back to work. So, Mr. City Attorney, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Honorable members of the committee, council members, Mr. Rosendahl, it's a pleasure seeing you.
Same here. Thank you. Glad I can be here.
So am I. Not to say that any of your presences are any less appreciated. I found it interesting to listen to the CAO's comments about the Treasury and how it's necessary to protect our Treasury. The last thing you want to do when your Treasury is being attacked is to let the guard down at the gate. And exactly what we are proposing in terms of and I'll call it the firing of 50 prosecutors, is just that. The results of doing just that would be devastating to the taxpayers and the residents of the city of Los Angeles. I have a chart that I prepared, because I know that the chairman likes charts. So let me...
If you could hold it over near the clock, that way we can see it and the whole audience can see it. Thank you.
In terms of our office, in terms of verdicts, in the last 3 years, we've had an unprecedented 86% success rate, saving $235 million. We've reduced outside counsel fees. In 1 year, we were almost down to $8 million. Now we're starting to inch back up again because we're such at a dearth of lawyers, saving taxpayers $12 million. We've collected more in terms of taxes with less bodies, 15 million. I think our predecessor was at what number?
In 1 year, $2 million.
$2.3 million. And we've done this remarkably. The city attorneys for this great city have done this with a reduction in staff. When I started, we were somewhere in the neighborhood of 647 attorneys. We're down below 500 now. We've done more with less. The lawyers that you see in the audience today have paid with their sweat to impose on top of 36 days of furloughs that they've had for the last 3 years, and we use that as a budget tool to help us finance, because in 2 previous years, I believe we were at an $18 million projected deficit, an $11.7 million projected deficit, and each of those previous years, we've balanced and finished with a surplus. Right now, this year, we are projected to have a $118,000 surplus. The proposal is to take away the furloughs and impose layoffs. The layoffs are not imposed as you would think they would be, going in at the bottom, first in, or last in, first out. But they would be cascading through the departments, creating a devastating effect on trial preparation, on cases that would affect the city's liability, creating far much more havoc than the benefit derived. There are solutions, and we've, Mr. Chairman, we addressed a letter to you earlier today. There are solutions that are outlined in that we have not explored. And so to move to this point without exploring all the solutions, I think is a mistake, a very, very big mistake. And that we're making this mistake at the lives of people who have been the most dedicated over the last 4 years. Part 1 crime is down in the city of Los Angeles. Last month it was down just a smidgen, about, it was not very much, but it was down just a little bit. But I can assure you that Part 2 crime is not. And we need to stay vigilant in order to keep Part 1 crime down, to keep this city safe. Removing prosecutors is not the answer. We need to find the solutions necessary to make this work and to keep our office intact. Don't take the guards down at the Treasury door without exploring every single possibility that there can be to explore. I invite you to sit with us to find a solution before we exercise something that is so draconian. Thank you.
Thank you. And members, did each of you receive a copy of the letter? Okay.
I'll get you a
if you
copy.
could just make sure that each of the members...
Before the end of this meeting. In fact, I'll get you a copy right now.
And then, because you're distributing that to each of us during this meeting, it'll need to be made publicly available as well. So if we have a few extra copies that we can make available to the public, that would be helpful and would help us comply with the Brown Act. All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Trutanich. I would invite some members of your team to stay, because you're probably going to want to respond to some questions when we get to this section of the FSR. But I don't need to keep you this whole time. I know you have other things to do. Yeah, Mr. Rosendahl.
Highlight quickly the issues that you are most clear about and feel need to be addressed. I know your report's here. 2 or 3 of them, or whatever is the one that's dearest to your heart. Just so
well, I mean, look we have planning, the CAO's office, the mayor's office, hiring during the last 3 years. We haven't hired one person in 3 years. We've hired no one.
Right.
The caseload continues, the workload continues, and and our funding is going this way, and the work is going this way. It's not that this office has not contributed. And to cut it even further is going to risk the city in terms of the long run. You can't expect the lawsuits to decrease. They haven't decreased. If you take workers' comp and civil, put them together, we're over 7,000 lawsuits in the city. And you look at the numbers that we have, the caseloads are astounding. To cut it even further would be to jeopardize. And if the proposal is to hire outside counsel, the cost would be through the roof. This is the best buy going.
Thank you.
All right, members, any other questions for the city attorney before he goes? All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Trutanich. So then what I'd ask members is if we could just quickly go through, as we have in the past, through the FSR and identify which departments you're going to have questions for, so that we can release those that aren't here. Let's do this first so that the department representatives can go, then we'll take public comment, then we'll hear the full report.
I mean, just, I want the police department to be one of them.
Okay. So LAPD, Fire, General Services, and the City Attorney's Office as far as I'm concerned. And then if there are others that you're interested in asking about.
Is anybody going to say fire? Because if you're not, I just want to applaud them for what they've been doing with me lately with Engine Company up in the Palisades. It's been stellar. Every time the winds get in and we start to worry, Chief Cummings has been outstanding.
I am going to ask for Fire to come to the desk, yes.
So happy.
Any others, members?
Yeah.
Mr. Englander.
Well, there's categories that maybe depends on the department who's dealing with it, but on the GST, OPS consolidation, I got a question on that.
Well, we're going to have General Services and LAPD both, so.
Building and safety,
Okay, Building and Safety will be,
fire department. I assume things like layoff avoidance in different categories will be our CAO.
I would think so. It's up,
Can we ask
it
our
depends
CEO
on
to
what your
stay?
question. Yeah, I think he's going to stay.
I think that's good for now. I had a couple others.
Okay. Mr. Kretz, anything further?
No, I think you hit it all.
Okay, so we'd like to ask the representatives of LAPD, Fire, GSA, City, and what was that? Oh, City Attorney, of course, and Building and Safety to stay. Any other department representatives? Thank you very much for coming down. You can go. And we'll follow up with you later if we have further questions. Get out while the getting's good. Quick, quick, quick. All right, so then, again, in order to clear the room as much as we can and be respectful of people's time, we're going to go ahead and take public comment now on the FSR, and then we'll hear the full report. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. We got about. Bill, are you okay? Bill.
Yes, sir.
Take about 40 minutes.
You sure? But I got to leave it before.
No problem, no problem. All right, so let's go ahead and we're going to take 2 minutes per speaker. But again, as Mr. Rosendahl mentioned, if you don't need to use all 2 minutes, that's fine as well. Don't feel compelled. Okay. Animal Services, although they weren't called, would like to speak as well, so we'll be hearing from them as well. All right, so our first speaker is Bernie Brown, followed by Andre Quintero.
Thank you, gentlemen. My name is Bernie Brown. I'm the supervising attorney for the Central Criminal Branch of the Los Angeles City Attorney's Office. I merely want to state that the proposal of laying off 50 city attorneys will jeopardize the security of every citizen in the city of Los Angeles. What will happen is you will not have enough prosecutors to prosecute the crimes that are occurring within the city. I mean, that is the absolute result that you will see. We currently review approximately 125,000 cases. We generate 60,000 complaints, conduct 500 trials. We are in courtrooms throughout the city and county of Los Angeles. We are being sent to courtrooms as far away as Pomona, Lancaster, throughout the entire city. And we are prosecuting crimes that would regularly be filed as felonies in any other county, or any other state, I should say. Just an example: spousal abuse, child abuse, drug possession, being under the influence of drugs, DUI, prostitution, grand theft, threats, cyber threats. We still have, hundreds of cases involving demonstration cases, possession of guns, vehicular manslaughter, failure to register as a sexual offender, battery on an officer, resisting arrest. The list goes on and on and on with serious criminal offenses, graffiti. What we are talking about here is a massive diminishing of the security of our citizens of this great city. I mean, these are crimes that affect every citizen in the city of Los Angeles, and each citizen is going to be less secure if this proposal passes.
Thank you very much. And again, folks, just as a reminder for those who came in late, there is overflow seating in room 1020, which is right next door. You'll be able to hear everything that goes on in here if you want to take a load off and have a seat. All right, the next speaker is Andre Quintero, followed by Brad Rothenberg.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. My name is Andre Quintero, and I'm a deputy city attorney. You're going to hear from a number of deputy city attorneys today, and you've already heard from management. These attorneys are hardworking attorneys who protect the interests of our residents, businesses, and taxpayers of the city of Los Angeles. My current assignment is in the Safe Neighborhoods Division. As you know, we deal with the quality of life crimes. And I can tell you this last fiscal year, I filed more than 1,110 cases. Not only do I file those cases, but I have to vertically prosecute them. I have to see them all the way through to the very end. I also handle street vending cases. How many times do you hear about street vendors and those issues? Who wants to prosecute those cases? They're very difficult to prosecute because you're talking about people's livelihoods. And we know that obviously street vending is illegal in the city of Los Angeles. That sometimes it's very hard to explain to folks, particularly jurors. But they're important cases, and they're cases that matter to our businesses in particular who complain about the street vending that's taking place. This fiscal year, in 4 short months, I filed more than 400 cases and reviewed more than 600 cases, and I have to see them all the way through. But I also have the unique perspective of being the mayor of another city, and so I understand exactly the kind of challenges that you're facing. Although my budget's a lot less, our general fund budget is about $50 million, a lot less than what you have to deal with.
City?
50 million, City of El Monte, in the San Gabriel Valley. I understand fully well, though, how to work with our bargaining units, our employees. We got 3-year contracts extending to 2015. We had contractually obligated increases to our police officers that we extended 3 years. They worked with us, and our general city employees did the same. If nothing else, we're reasonable. We're lawyers. We have to be reasonable, right? But you got to work with us, and we want to make sure that we continue to do the best work that we can on behalf of all the people of the city of Los Angeles. We're looking to you for that leadership to help us to continue to do that. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Brad Rothenberg, followed by, Annika Cole, I think it is. Mr. Rothenberg, welcome.
Thank you. I'm currently assigned to the Central Operations, and I work for Bernie Brown. I'm a prosecutor with the city. I've been here 4 years. I left the city of Inglewood, where I was a prosecutor for a year. My passion is to protect victims and people of this city. I grew up in this city. My parents grew up in this city. And I chose to be here. And I want to talk about what I've done in my time here to protect people. And in 2010, I handled all the riot cases that occurred from the Lakers victory party. We had people who were convicted of vandalism, inciting a riot, battery on police officers, resisting arrest. Those were all my cases. Other things, we've had other riots across the county, or county and city. There was a riot in Hollywood. There was a riot at Pico and Union, the Westlake riots. I handled those. Those were my cases. The other cases I have at any one time are domestic violence cases, about 20 at a time, and if one disposed or I get a conviction, I get a new one. And those are women who have been hurt by their spouses, men who've been hurt by their spouses, broken bones. They've gone to the hospital, and I've helped these people out. I also do sex crimes where people are sexually battered. The other thing I've been working on is the Occupy LA cases. I've convicted dozens of people who have protested and stayed at the City Hall Park, and I've got them on probation. I've kept them away from City Hall Park to protect our park. I've dealt with threats against council members and even dealt with a riot in city council chambers a year ago. I took that to jury trial and convicted an individual of 9 counts of battery on officers and resisting arrest for a riot that occurred in council chamber.
Thank you very much, sir. Next speaker is Ms. Cole, followed by Vanessa Alvarado. Ms. Cole, welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Annika Cole, and I'm a deputy city attorney. I'm also criminal director of MOU 29, and I've been with the office since March of 2002. I am currently assigned to the Special Litigation Branch, which has been targeted in the FSR for cuts. I'm going to urgently ask this committee and the full City Council to reject the proposal to remove 50 prosecutors from our office. We cannot lose one person and continue to do the excellent work that we do for you. Last year, the section that I'm in generated more than $8 million that helped provide relief to the general fund. 50% of that money by statute has to go to the local DA's office, and 50% has to be used to do consumer protection work. I'm a frontline consumer protection prosecutor. My focus is filing both criminal and civil cases to protect the citizens of Los Angeles. I go after those people who would practice medicine without a license, provide dental surgery without a license, practice law without a license, do immigration consulting without a license, those who perpetuate real estate fraud and loan modification schemes, contractors who leave homeowners high and dry, auto repair dealers who scam the average citizen. I also go after banks who allow their properties to languish within our cities and blight up our neighborhoods. I go after healthcare providers who dump patients. As a misdemeanor criminal prosecutor, we are usually the last and final line of defense. Please do not erode our last line. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Vanessa Alvarado, excuse me, followed by Amy Brothers.
Hi. My name is number 38, or also known as Deputy City Attorney Vanessa Alvarado. I'm in the bottom 50. Currently, I'm assigned to the citywide nuisance abatement program. What do? Well, we take care of the problem properties in your communities. We take care of the problem properties that deal with prostitution, narcotics, trash and debris. Those are the problem properties that your constituents call you and ask you to help them resolve. Well, I'm the city attorney that's assigned to North Hollywood, and Northeast. I'm the one that your LAPD officers or your field deputies call to get some kind of relief. I review all narcotics reports from all the LAPD officers, captains, and I attend neighborhood council meetings. I have case conferences with property owners, and I file nuisance abatement complaints. You know, I first moved to LA in December of 2005. I lived in Glassell Park, so I know firsthand what the effects of gangs, like the avenues, will have on a community. I lived in Boyle Heights, and in 2008, I had the privilege of buying a home in El Sereno. Well, guess what? After 3 years of furloughs, I no longer have that house. I had to short sale it. I couldn't afford to live in the community that I serve. So while I may no longer be a constituent, I am a member of your community. I work to serve your communities and with dignity and respect. That's what I want to do for your constituents. And I'm trying to make their communities and their homes a better place to live. So whether you lay off prosecutors or you lay off from the civil division, you will be doing your part, along with furloughs, to cut down the services and benefits your communities receive from our work.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Amy Brothers, followed by Nancy Wax.
Good afternoon, council members. I'm Deputy City Attorney Amy Brothers, assigned to the Land Use Division. Many of you have worked with me in the past. The last time I addressed this committee was last spring, when the committee was considering the budget for the City Attorney's Office. At that time, I emphasized that we were not properly funded. I said we'd lost too many attorneys and we needed to hire more attorneys. Today, I ask you to reject the CAO proposal to lay off 50 attorneys. I ask you to reject the notion that even one city attorney should be laid off or furloughed. We've lost 110 attorneys since July 2009. That's about 20% of the office. We have not been able to hire since that time. The CAO proposes to cut another 10% of the attorneys from our office, even as other departments that we serve, that we advise, that we defend, including planning, including building and safety, are hiring. The work we attorneys are tasked with completing has not diminished. Some of you seem to acknowledge this when you signed a motion on Friday. While I disagree with the premise that the attorneys in my office have not produced outstanding results given the persistent underfunding of my office, I do agree there is a vast amount of work for the attorneys in our office. If you want to save money, you will not do so by laying off a single attorney, let alone 50. As the city attorney mentioned, the costs for outside counsel are going up because of the dire understaffing of the attorney section of our office. And I just want to ask for you in the audience, who here is in danger of being laid off? Can you show me your hands? Can you show me your hands? Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Nancy Wax, followed by Gabrielle Taylor.
Councilman, I'm Deputy City Attorney Nancy Wax, and I work in the Real Property and Environment Division. I'm also a second-generation Angelino and a taxpayer in this city. Nearly 6 years ago, I came to work for the city after almost 25 years in private practice. I was looking forward to working for the city I grew up in. Now, because I'm in the last 50 hired, I face a layoff under the CAO's proposal, a proposal that will diminish my ability to pay my mortgage, to pay my property taxes, or to even spend money in this city. Currently, I'm one of 2 attorneys handling inverse condemnation and working on recommending changes to the liability law up in Sacramento that would reduce city exposure. I also am one of the few attorneys handling the environmental matters on the civil side. Some of you have worked with me, and as you know, I work with Department of Sanitation, Building and Safety, Rec and Parks, and other departments, not only in environmental issues, but all real property issues, including landslides and lease disputes. The favorable resolution of these matters directly affect the city's financial well-being. On some of these matters, I see the bills submitted by outside counsel to other public entities that are co-defendants in our cases. I can assure you the cost of these outside counsel far exceed the services we provide, and they will not save the city money. I urge you to reject the CAO's proposal to lay off city attorneys. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Gabrielle Taylor, followed by Kevin Gilligan.
My name is Gabrielle Porter Taylor, and I've been a city attorney for almost 7 years. I used to get teased by my supervisors at the Family Violence Unit that I got an F in furlough because I rarely took any furlough days off or my hours off. Why? because my cases and my victims came first. I gave my time and my hours and my money to this city without thought of reward, because being a prosecutor is my calling. And I'm just one of many here, in the criminal division especially, that does the same every day. We work for free. And now I feel like a fool, because my commitment and sacrifice to this city and its people is for nothing. The CAO, with the mayor's blessing, is throwing out criminal prosecutors like we're trash. We are not the enemy here. We are simply trying to do right by the city and its people and make this city a safer and better place. Yet somehow, according to the CAO, being a criminal prosecutor is a crime that needs to be punished. Meanwhile, real crimes will go unchecked and real criminals will go unpunished, because if we have no prosecutors to prosecute them. I urge you to keep this city safe and, more importantly, restore the faith of a faithful public servant. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Kevin Gilligan, followed by Casey Shim.
Good afternoon, council members. Councilman Rosendahl, it's nice to see you back again. My name is Kevin Gilligan. I'm a 20-year veteran of the LA City Attorney's Office. I'm a public servant. I'm proud to be a public servant. Somewhere along the line, becoming a public servant, being a prosecutor has become a dirty word. We've dedicated our lives to this. We could have taken jobs with more money outside, but we didn't, because we wanted to do the right thing and help people. That's why we're here. Deputy city attorneys play a critical role in public safety and the quality of life in Los Angeles. All of you are concerned about money coming in, and rightfully you should be. I'm sorry, you have a tough job. It is tough. But if quality of life in neighborhoods goes down, businesses don't want to be here, the middle class doesn't want to be here, people leave, and it ultimately becomes a downward spiral. You know this. The quality of life prosecutions that the city attorney's office does are critical. The DA's office is not going to do those. If you get rid of us, they're not going to happen. I have relatives in the DA's office who work there, who have worked there. I know lots of DAs. I love them. They're great. They're not going to do these crimes. These are the crimes that matter to LA neighborhoods, to your constituents. Over the years, I ran this neighborhood prosecutor program in South LA. I got so many calls from council offices who wanted help. How do we solve this problem? We can't fix it. You know, your deputies would call us. You would call them and say, fix it, and they would call us, and we would help them. We do things that other people in the city don't do. In addition to the DUIs and the other crimes that people in Los Angeles would be shocked to know that we do. Gang members with guns. I tried a case where a man swung an axe at two people's heads as a misdemeanor in LA. What goes for a misdemeanor in LA is out of control. If your constituents knew it, they wouldn't believe it. They wouldn't believe it. There'd be felonies anywhere else. We do groundbreaking work. Our community prosecution program has been a national model that has been copied by district attorneys' offices across the country. I'm doing counterfeit abatement work. We just got a grant from the Department of Justice, and they said what we're doing is groundbreaking. No one else, hardly anyone else in the country is doing it. We do amazing work here. These folks don't sing their own praises enough. They ought to.
Thank you. One moment, Mr. Gilligan. Mr. Kretz had a question. Mr. Gilligan.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, not exactly on point, but we've heard it mentioned a few times that cases that clearly should be prosecuted at a higher level are prosecuted here. Why are we doing the DA's work? How are there all these cases that clearly do seem like they should be prosecuted at a higher level, not done here?
Councilman, this is a bigger discussion, but truthfully, they have a high volume. They've got a lot of cases. They're short-staffed. And a lot of cases that roughly, I've seen estimates that as much as 75% of LA's Part 1 crimes, the felony crimes, are prosecuted and dropped down to misdemeanors. So the exact reason, I think they're overloaded. I think that there are cases where they have such strong evidence that when something is tough to do, that they defer it to us. That case that I referred to earlier where the defendant swung an axe at two people's head, it was at night and it was a cross-racial identification. The DA's office declined to do it for ID problems. I tried it. I won it. We handle amazing cases here and work, and your constituents would be shocked to see what goes as a misdemeanor here.
I think we probably all would be. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Just love to have a longer discussion about that, but in public comment, it's your time to speak, and we don't want to have too much of a dialogue. So our next speaker is Casey Shim, followed by Jennifer Ramirez.
Good afternoon, council members. My name is Casey Shim. The city hired me from private practice to work in the employment litigation section as a Deputy City Attorney 3. I started here on January 2nd, 2008. About 2 years ago, our section split into two parts, and 13 Deputy City Attorneys remained to handle the cases in the police employment litigation section, defending the city in cases where police officers allege violations of civil rights and other statutory rights, discrimination, and retaliation. Over the past 4 years and 9 months, I have first or second chaired 12 jury and 2 bench trials involving claims by 25 plaintiffs, and the final result in 10 of those cases was an ultimate defense where the city ended up paying nothing. My experience and record are not unique in our section. The police employment litigation section now has 10 attorneys. 3 times since January of this year, we have advertised internally for at least one opening. We've had 0 applicants. After bumping, I expect that as many as myself and 3 others in the section will end up being fired. As members of this committee know, employment cases represent a substantial risk to city coffers. Action that would amount to gutting this section, well, I leave that decision to your good judgment. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Jennifer Ramirez, followed by Jennifer Waxler.
Hi, good afternoon. I'll just briefly address the last question that Councilman Kretz had. I'm the deputy that reviews many of those cases that are referred, that are felony arrests and come referred to our office from the district attorney, or are sent to us by a bypass mechanism by watch commanders or senior detectives. I routinely review felony arrests every day. I make the decision with detectives in my office whether these cases will go forward for criminal prosecution or handled in alternative means. I've been with the office since 1999. I've been a criminal prosecutor in central trials since that time. When I first started, there were 45 attorneys in my section. Now there are approximately 19 that are full-time. Although furloughs have impacted us greatly, as have the reductions to our benefits, we routinely work over hours for free, as some of my colleagues have mentioned, because our commitment is to these victims, our oath as prosecutors, and our ethical obligations. We prosecute thousands of cases a month brought to us from the DA, LAPD, sheriffs, and many other agencies, including federal. If 50 prosecutors are cut from our office, which crimes would you have me tell my detectives not to bring? Which crimes would you tell me to tell them no longer matter in the city of Los Angeles? Crimes I review every day and refer are identity theft, violence against children, sexual assault, child pornography, hate crime, gang crimes, domestic violence, gun crimes, drugs, aggravated trespasses into individuals' homes, elder abuse, DUIs, weapons crimes, grand theft auto, commercial burglary, and sex offender registrations. If there's further decimation of criminal prosecutors in our office, that tells the people of Los Angeles, the victims, your constituents, that crime does not matter, what happens to them does not matter. You're telling criminals there is no consequence for their actions. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Jennifer Waxler, followed by Heidi Matz. Welcome.
Good afternoon, council members. Councilman Rosal, you mentioned that you were proud of the fire department because they have come to Pasadena and they're doing such a fabulous job. And that's because I would imagine that you were a victim of these fires. Well, that's how our victims feel to us. That's how we feel. I get calls from the Los Angeles Police Department on a regular basis when we prosecute the cases in which they make the arrests. That's how the victims of these domestic violence cases feel when we prosecute and those cases where they can't fight for themselves and we're the people that fight for them. So if any of you have been a victim of a crime, as you seem to be, but it's just not a crime, it's a fire, it's environmental, that's how the victims would feel. And if we're gone, we can't help anybody. I have been a prosecutor for 17 years. I started my career in the Bronx. I've been here for almost 5 years. I've spent the last year prosecuting and working with Los Angeles Police Department on Occupy LA. I just recently spoke at POST, the Peace Officer Standards and Training, and I had so many officers and district attorneys come up to me and say, wow, you are the first agency that are prosecuting these people for the crimes that they've committed under the Occupy movements. We do these things because we believe in it, and we have the courage to fight. And if you get rid of us, and I will be one of those people that you fire. I am on that list. There will be nobody to fight. There will be nobody that you can thank to put out your fires. That's what's going to happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Heidi Metz, followed by Carlos Ramirez.
Thank you. I'm Heidi Metz, and I'm assigned to Central Trials. It's criminal. I've been with the office for 5 years. I am one of the 50 to be fired. This job is more than just my job. It is my passion. It's all of their passion. It is my family. These are my family members out here. And by taking this job away from me, you're taking away everything. But enough about me. What can I do for you? I have prosecuted 45 jury trials. In the last year and a half, I have had 100% conviction rate. And these are not just petty thefts or prostitution cases. What I do now is 290 registration cases, which means sex offender cases. These sex offense cases make sure that these convicted people register for life as sex offenders. In the case of People versus Rogers, because of the misdemeanor prosecution that I did, that I won the trial on, Mr. Rogers is now a felon because of my prior prosecution. In the case of People versus McIntyre, the defendant got 2.5 years in jail in what another county would have filed as an attempted rape. This is a misdemeanor, but I have put my life and my soul and my guts into my job. And I'm asking you, please, do not lay off a single person. We need every one of us, and every one of us loves our job. It's our family and our life. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Carlos Ramirez, followed by Elizabeth Mitchell. Mr. Ramirez.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to say a couple words. I have been a deputy city attorney in criminal branch for almost 15 years now. I am pretty well insulated from the layoff if it goes according to how either you are projecting or how the CEO is projecting or how the cascading effect will affect our office. I'm pretty well insulated. That is my wife, Jennifer Ramirez, who spoke earlier. We're pretty well insulated, but yet we're still here to fight to keep those 50 positions because our jobs are made much harder by the elimination of the younger folks, because it's going to cascade down to the earlier people that just got hired on. I staffed the highest volume court in our city, Central Court, across the street, Department 40. I and my partner, we handled 60 to 100 cases a day, every day. This morning, we handled 60 cases a day. And I just took a sample of the cases that we did. Burglary, domestic violence assaults, 487s, failing to register, lewd conduct. We got using a trademark without proper permitting, battery on a police officer, prostitution. I handled those cases today before coming here. I sentenced somebody to 365 days in county jail for failing to do what he was supposed to do when he was on probation for domestic violence. And the reason I was able to do that, because the defense understands I have people behind me who are going to try those cases. Those people, you have heard from them. There are the Jennifer Waxlers, the Heidi Maxes, the Brad Rothenbergs. Those are the people that I turn to when I say, take my deal or it's trial. And they say trial, and I give it to them, and they win the cases. If you eliminate those 50 positions, they are gone. We have donated a lot of time in addition to our own time as prosecutors to be here. I work 75 hours, and my wife works 75 hours on a 2-week pay period. We only get paid for 68.5 last year. Why do we do that? Why do we give so much free time to the city? Because we are prosecutors.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Our next speaker is Elizabeth Mitchell, followed by Richard Kraft. Ms. Mitchell.
Good afternoon, council members. My name is Elizabeth Mitchell. I'm currently in our police litigation division.
I have looked at the MOU, and I don't see how it's legally possible to lay off just prosecutors and not start from the bottom or not cascade down. In which case, even though I'm civil, I'm getting laid off because I'm number 23 on that list. I've been in the office for 5 years. Now, if I get laid off, I have a mortgage I can't pay. I have $100,000 in student loans that I can't pay. But the dollars and cents of it, I think, is a little more important at this point. If you look at what I do, I'm one of 12 trial attorneys, and we appear in front of this council regularly. I'm one of 12 trial attorneys that handles a caseload, each of us worth tens of millions of dollars if it goes poorly. So I'm not alone in this. There are 3 of us, 3 people in police litigation that are in the bottom 25. If you lay us off, that'll be devastating to the city. Just one of my cases that I'm working on, if it goes poorly, we're looking at a $50 million hit to the city. You're going to take $50 million to save 5? It doesn't make sense. And like I said, I'm just one of 3. Just today, I had a summary judgment motion granted in federal court in front of Judge Wilson, who, if you'll remember, is not such a big fan of us right now. He granted a summary judgment motion on an Occupy LA case. I must have put in 100 hours on that case. You farm that out to outside counsel, that'll cost you $25,000 easy. And that's just one of my cases. So we're looking at, if you let me go, you're looking at 3 of us from police litigation. Now, our management, Bill Carter's amazing, but he is not going to be able to backfill those positions because 50 of us are going to be gone. So what's going to happen to those is either cases are going to start settling that don't need to settle, which is going to cost you millions of dollars, or cases are going to go to trial we're going to lose because we don't have the attorneys to work that up. That's going to cost you millions of dollars. Or you're going to give it to outside counsel who are going to charge you 5 times as much as what I get paid to do the same work I do, but not nearly as well and not nearly as passionate. So if you want...
Thank you. Our next speaker is Richard Kraft, followed by Oscar Winslow. Mr. Kraft.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm the supervising attorney of the Special Victims Section, and I want to assure you that in balancing the budget, the City Attorney's Office and prosecutors are your least expendable resource. I'd like you to know some of the types of crimes we prosecute. You've heard about them, but I think they're worth repeating. Sexual assault crimes, sexual exploitation of children through technology, child pornography, internet crimes against children, industrial fatalities and injuries, hate crimes, large financial crimes, public protest crimes. The budget has already impacted us substantially. My unit was at 8, now it's down to 3. Each one of us carries a full load. Because of a lack of resources, we now handle our own appeals and our own habeas matters. I'd like to tell you about a few of our cases so you get an idea of the dimensions. A case you might know about, the Prestige parking case, one of the biggest theft cases of city taxes, stealing your money, stealing our money, just pocketing it. And we prosecuted him 297 counts he was convicted of, him and his company, ordered to pay $700,000 in restitution to the city. And while he hasn't paid it all yet, it's accruing interest at 10%. So it's a good rate of return for the moment. But that's the kind of effort that's required to enforce the city's laws and to send a message to other offenders that if you, by the way, he went to jail for 1.5 years. If you break our laws, you're going to jail. For a financial crime, you're going to jail. An industrial fatality case we prosecuted. A fellow fell 50 feet to his death because there were no guardrails, there was no fall protection. 3rd time the employer had been warned about this, and this time, unfortunately, there was a fatality. Referred by the DA's office. We prosecuted. There was justice for that individual. There would have been none but for our office, and that's the same problem in a rape case we handled because the district attorney's office rejected it. We filed sexual battery, false imprisonment, ADW, convicted, 5 years in jail, 290 registration. There would be no justice but for the hard work and effort of these men and women.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Oscar Winslow, followed by Ted Rorlick.
Thank you, Committee. Mr. Chairman, I'm President of the Los Angeles City Attorneys Association. I'd ask for 3 minutes, please.
Why don't you try to keep going and
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
forward a little
CAO's
bit if you need it.
FSR makes it clear that the mayor and the CAO are once again resorting to blatant distortions in order to intimidate the city attorneys into never-ending salary concessions. In 2009, the city attorneys agreed to defer by 2 years the modest cost of living increases legally negotiated with the city. Civilian employees, including city attorneys, also agreed to a limited number of unpaid furlough days for that fiscal year. City leaders assured employees at that time that the concessions would be sufficient and that the city could avoid layoffs with those concessions. 6 months later, the city was back again for more concessions, but this time with threats of layoffs and freezing vested rights after having breached the no layoff promise it had just made to the civilian unions. LECAA members responded to this deceitfulness by declining to agree to any more salary concessions. The city nonetheless unilaterally imposed a 14.5% pay cut on city attorneys and a permanent freeze of the vested retiree health subsidy promised to all employees upon retirement. The city said it needed 4%, but it unilaterally took 14.5% year after year. In spite of the fact that the city is in breach of its contractual obligations to us, we saved you $235 million. What good is making a contract and collective bargaining if the city can break that contract when they choose and impose any terms they like? This city reaps a huge public benefit from the dedication of its attorneys. We're critical of public safety of the city in that we prosecute over 70% of LAPD's arrests, 90% of CHP's arrests, including the DUIs. Additionally, LACAA members successfully handle the bulk of the city's civil litigation in a very cost-efficient manner. The stellar track record of city attorneys' civil litigators is unparalleled. Simply put, the city cannot get better legal representation anywhere at the same cost. LACAA was forced to file lawsuits to protect the legal rights of its members under the current labor contract and to protect the vested retirement rights of its members. Just a little bit more. Just recently, a federal judge ordered the city and LACAA to commence settlement negotiations. The CAO and the mayor responded to that judge by announcing their intent to lay off 50 LACAA members and to strip the city attorney's office of its charter-mandated obligation to handle civil litigation on behalf of the city. The mayor and the CAO claim that this action is not retaliation against LACAA for protecting their rights under the law. Mr. Santana's FSR clearly reveals exactly the opposite.
Thank you.
Just a brief moment here.
Just if you could wrap it up.
This office has lost 110 attorneys in the last 3 years. We have yet to get credit for those losses in the budget. We now rely on a substantial pool of unpaid volunteers to fill the void. The office cannot continue to meet the charter-mandated duties under these circumstances. If council follows the recommendation of the mayor and the CAO, LACAA will have no choice but to take further litigation. We have to protect those 50 members.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Ted Rorlick, followed by Dick Ransasunya.
Hi, I'm Ted Rorlick. I'm the Research Director for SEIU Local 721. And I'm here to comment today on the tie between the CEO's plan to lay off 259 city employees and its tie to millions of dollars in idle city funds that have been unclaimed by the CAO. We're gratified that the CAO appears finally to be validating our position that there are such funds, that the general fund has many millions of dollars sitting idly in various departments for no good purpose in the form of unspent prior year encumbrances. $25 million of that money has been sitting idly for over 2 years. A small portion of that, very small, has been sitting idly for more than a decade, despite CAO periodic reviews of that money. We were able to confirm this recently by reviewing more than 4,000 purchase orders supplied to us by the Comptroller's Office for all outstanding prior year encumbrances. The net result of our review, as I outlined in a letter to the chairman, Mr. Kerkorian, last week, was that we found that $77 million of the $113 million in prior year encumbrances were not, in our opinion, justified. The CAO is now entering its second month of promised review and says it hopes to have its results to us by Thanksgiving. Meanwhile, however, the CAO has issued its first financial status report of the new year, and we found one aspect of this deeply troubling. Specifically, his suggestion on pages 4 and 5 that savings from recouping prior year encumbrances go into a rainy day fund. We have no objection to a robust rainy day fund, a budget stabilization fund, but we are deeply troubled because it's raining right now on the ladies and gentlemen in this audience and 209 other city workers targeted for layoffs, and the services they provide, and we think that any of that money should be used to forestall that. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Dick Sassoonian, followed by Steve Koffroth. Mr. Sassoonian.
Thank you. Honorable council members, Mr. CEO Santana. My name's Dick Sassoonian. I work in your general civil liability section. My wife Hoodie is a prosecutor out in the valley, and my son Manuel is a 2-year-old preschooler at Ferahian Preschool up in North Hills. I have 16 years of civil experience. I am also number 47 on the list. I'm one of 4 attorneys that you have in the general civil liability section that has over 3 years experience. And you have me right now for less than $55 an hour. I understand that discussing with you the devastating effects these layoffs would have on me and my family, because both me and my wife would be thrown out of work. I wanted to address how it would address the city. In the last year, I have handled 2 cases, I have gone to trial over 2 cases with over $1 million of exposure. On both those cases, they had a combined exposure of $4 million, and by that I mean the actual hard meds totaled $4 million along with loss of earnings. I was able to get combined judgment against the city for $400,000. That's a $3.6 million savings, and that's just on 2 of my 44 cases. On top of that, I have lost 56 hours of work, even though I do not take furlough. 56 hours of vacation time. That means that in excess of all the 200 hours I have built up, in excess of all the vacation time I have, in addition to that, lost time just because I have been in the office working for the city of Los Angeles, which I'm very proud to do. No private attorney will give you 55 hours of free work. If I am laid off, I am going to be replaced by somebody in criminal who has never seen an interrogatory since they have been to law school. Currently, my caseload is 44 cases, of which 7 have exposure of over $2 million. Besides from that, it will have a devastating effect on my family. We will lose our entire income, our health care coverage, and the only savings I can come up with right now would be to yank my son from preschool, and I'd ask you not to do that. I thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Our next speaker is Steve Koffroth, followed by Noel Weiss.
Thank you, council members. Steve Koffroth with the American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees. We're a member of the Coalition of LA City Unions. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to review all of the things that we have gone through in the last budget cycle, but the coalition was pretty aggressive and forthcoming with many ideas, both from a budget savings impact and from a revenue generation impact, in order to solve the city's problems with its budget. I'm sad to say that after going through all that effort, that very few of them have been considered, let alone implemented. And as you heard from Mr. Rohrlich earlier, from our brothers and sisters at SEIU, a major thing that could be done quickly and has a $100 million impact to the budget still is supposedly under review and should be enacted. Before you go into the harsh realities of layoffs, not just of the attorneys in this room, but our members and other employees of the city, please make sure that the CAO does its job. It can't be a one kind of solution. Cut the employees, cut their benefits, lay them off. That can't be the only way to solve our budget problems. Please don't let that happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Noel Weiss, followed by Lori Rittenberg. And as of right now, that's the last card I have, so if anybody else wants to speak on this matter, please fill out a card and bring it forward. Mr. Weiss.
Thank you. My question, why 50? Why not 40? Why not 30? Why not 25? In other words, what's the logic, what's the analysis, what's the source of real, thoughtful thinking about this? Anything? I think it's anytime, cardinal rule number 1 when dealing with the city council, one always has to look for the head fake. What's the head fake? Do we want to basically split the criminal division and the civil division and have the DA prosecute penal misdemeanors? Is that the goal? Is that the objective that we want to do? Maybe kind of inferred from Mr. Koretz's question. You know what? If that's it, do it straight away, people. Don't do this. It's not right. The city attorney acts to the extent possible as a check on the abuse of power by you people. This has the sense of political retribution across the bow. Don't cross me, the mayor. You know what? Not right. And that's assuming, by the way, that what's proposed is even legal, which is a questionable proposition. Section 1050 of the charter, I think, and if I was a city attorney, I'd sue you people because this is not right, what you're doing to these people. The independence and the integrity of the city attorney's department the city attorney's office needs to be maintained. It is not being maintained with proposals like this, and it can't be a serious proposal. I can't conceive of retired police officers like Mr. Englander or Joe Buscaiano voting to deprive the public of the needed safety that the city attorney's office provides. It doesn't make any sense. You want an analysis? Have the city attorney, direct them to keep track of their hours for 6 months. Lawyers and secretaries, let's see what the cost to the city is versus the benefits to the city and make a reasoned determination. This seems so incredibly stupid. It is beyond comprehension that you would even consider this. And the fact that the mayor would propose it is a disgrace. Now, going forward, we've got situations where we have UCLA not paying bed tax and Mr. Koretz doing nothing. He gives away variances without with unlawful, as does Mr. Rosendahl. We don't have and yet the city attorney can collect monies from those land use owners under the indemnity, and they're not even enforced. Let's start looking at those revenue sources.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Lori Rittenberg, and as of now, Ms. Rittenberg's our last speaker. Unless somebody else would like to speak, fill out a card and bring it forward, please. This is your chance. Ms. Rittenberg.
Good afternoon. I am the supervisor of the Business and Complex Litigation Division. I think you know me well. I come to you with proposed settlements and on massive cases. I talk to you about massive cases. My division is carrying at least $2 billion in liability, and I'm not exaggerating, and I think you all know that. There are only 9 of us in the Business and Complex Litigation Unit. 3 of those people are on the layoff list. 3 of those people, in addition to all the other cases they're handling, they are handling on their own without the assistance of outside counsel 5 class action lawsuits spanning all sorts of issues that are important to all of you and in the entire city. If we were to lose those 3 people, who's going to defend the cases? You know, these are experienced, they may not have been with the city that long, but they're very experienced litigators. And so that means we have to get experienced outside counsel. That'll cost 5 to 6 to 7 times more. And it would not be an efficient transfer from our attorneys to outside counsel. These kinds of cases don't transition that quickly. It takes a lot of time to get up to speed on them. I don't think that the courts would be particularly patient. And in addition, something to think about is, and I'm sure this is true with a lot of different attorneys in the office, but I'm speaking about my division. We represent almost every city department. And over the years, we have all developed very good working relationships with almost every city department, with every department we work with, through litigation. And so when a lawsuit comes in, we know exactly who to call, we know exactly how to get the information we need. And the last thing I want to say is, despite all the furloughs, some of my lawyers, including these 3, they work so hard, they get sick. And then they continue to work while they're sick. So that's all I want to say.
All right. Thank you very much. Okay, so that completes public comment on this agenda item. I don't know how many of you are going to stick around for the whole discussion, but just in case some of you are going to leave, let me just say I think there's probably unanimity, I think, on this panel in acknowledging the value and importance of the work that all of you do, both from a public safety perspective and from a fiscal perspective. You know, as the committee that reviews every settlement of every case, we well appreciate the value of the work that you do. And I just want to cite one statistic that I just found today in partial response to Mr. Koretz's comment and the comment of some of the public speakers, of Part 1 cases for which complaints are filed, LAPD arrests, Part 1 cases for which there's a filing, more than a third of them are prosecuted by the City Attorney's Office. Of 10,000 Part 1 cases. So 3,600 prosecuted as misdemeanors. Of Part 2 offenses, and we heard, including assaults, embezzlements, weapons offenses, sex offenses, narcotics cases, and so on, 85% of LAPD's arrests are filed as misdemeanors, which means they're generally prosecuted by these folks. So, and that's 80,000 misdemeanor complaints by LAPD in a given year. So I think we all well understand the impact of, even the status quo, let alone further cutbacks. At the same time, we're also having to grapple with the fact that there are minimal places left where we can make the kinds of reductions that we need to make in order to achieve a balanced budget, and all of them, in one way or the other, virtually all of them, involve people who are very important to this city. So I think we've heard all of you. I hope that you'll also hear us as we discuss the extraordinarily difficult task that we have ahead of us in trying to balance the competing priorities that are before us. Mr. Kretz.
Yeah, I don't know exactly how to frame this, but I've objected ever since I've been here, every time we've tried to cut the city attorney's office, because I've always made the point that the city attorney's office defends us, and when we cut money out of the budget, it's usually a net loss to us rather than a net gain. And so I've generally objected to that. The thing that we're dealing with, I think, relates to the furloughs that we've had in the department. And I think that's been done, rather than layoffs up to this point, as a more humane alternative. It's not ideal. People are stretched personally, and I think the department is sort of hanging on by its fingernails, but I think things are still working in that system. And I believe these layoffs are being proposed not on top of the furloughs, but because of the legal case against the furloughs. And that basically leaves us nothing in our toolbox to balance the city attorney's budget except for layoffs. So I don't know if maybe one or two of you in the audience that are rank and file members could speak to the idea of why that is viewed as a good thing among the city attorneys, that we get rid of the furloughs and force the city to be in a hole in terms of the city attorney's office and sort of be forced to look at these layoffs. Because I would prefer not to even have this on the table. I think it is quite as disruptive as you've described. But I'm not sure how much of a position we're in to take the alternative.
Thank you for framing the issue that way. I think that I would not want to start a back and forth dialogue and ask people to represent the viewpoints of the whole city attorney's office. I'm sure there's probably different viewpoints among different people depending on their personal circumstances. But I think before we engage in that sort of discussion, we ought to go ahead and hear our staff report, unless there's general other comments that members, Mr. Kretz, would you like to offer any other comments while you have the floor before we move on? I think it'll be really disruptive to the meeting if we start that kind of.
And I have a more general comment as well on the broad layoffs, because we didn't do layoffs until January. And my recollection is that we decided, although we had the money to not do any layoffs through the whole fiscal year, that we did it with the assumption that as we approached January, we would look at whether there were unfilled other positions that might be more important than some of the ones that we might protect as far as layoffs. It wasn't that we were preserving the right to lay off all those same people. So what I haven't figured out is why we're suddenly talking about laying off all these people. We're not talking about laying them off so we can replace them with an equal number of more necessary positions as we had discussed a few months ago. We're just talking about laying them off. So how are we in that position now where we're talking about laying off the people that we budgeted essentially not to lay off unless we had better positions to replace them with?
Okay, and Mr. Santana will speak to that when he gives his report. Mr. Rosendahl, any comments?
I just want to thank you all, first of all, for your passion, for your commitment to being a public servant. It hits my heart pretty hard. I also find it very difficult to buy into getting rid of attorneys that save us money from the private sector. Look, we just allocated the last $3 million we had, city attorneys fund for half the year just to bring in outside counsel. So I don't even know where we get the money for outside counsel. Better yet, lay off dedicated public servants. So I got to really hear the CAO and what they're coming from and understand why they think isn't cutting your nose to spite your face. I mean, that seems simply logical, but I don't know. I'm just one of the characters here in the play. But as we go forward, I want to hear the CAO and the CLA, Jerry Miller, where his head is at on that, or if there's anybody else that can give us some insight. But again, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Mr. Rosendahl. Mr. Englander, any comments at this point?
Real quickly.
Sure.
Because I wanted to echo a lot of those statements as well, and I particularly liked Mr. Koretz's recommendation not to have that dialogue here, but I think that dialogue needs to occur.
Absolutely.
And it needs to occur quickly, and I really do appreciate you bringing that up as well. And I'd also like to recognize not just the ones that are here and the ones that spoke, the ones that aren't here because they're still in trial, or the ones that aren't here because they're in their office, or the ones that aren't here because they're the 159 civilian LAPD personnel as well that aren't here today because they're in the stations working to support our men and women of the department, or the 12 that are slated that we're talking about for the fire department, or all the other departments for that matter. And all those that you're here, none of you mentioned that, but you're here representing them as well. That you're here as their voice because they're out in the field and can't make it down here today. I've heard from many of them as well. And so, I'll tell you this, that I didn't run for office to do this. I don't think any of us did. Had the idea of ever running for office to lay people off or have these kinds of discussions, or to say these are our decisions, and yes, these aren't important to our constituents, and these kinds of services that you provide, these are the core functions of the city. What's being talked about today are the last things, quite frankly, that we should ever be discussing. The first things, which we've failed to do miserably because of the debates and the problems and the political issues in dealing with whatever those might be. We need your help as well, not just to speak up at the last minute, not to come at the 11th hour, not to be the Monday morning quarterback, but when discussions are falling apart because we can't come to agreements on whether it's providing public-private partnerships with the zoo, or whatever that might be, where we have an impasse. All those issues that are looming out there that we've talked about and debated, when we're out there on the council floor talking to the media, or we're out there talking to constituents or neighborhood council groups or special interests or unions or private companies or nonprofits, and we're talking about how are we going to run this city on a shoestring budget and get through this, we can't do it alone and just hear from you when your name comes up on a list. Because we're dealing with this every single day. And it's not going to get any time better. It's not going to get better anytime soon in the next couple years, as we all know, without a doubt, until we make very significant changes. And we need your help. That's where we're at. That's what we're dealing with every day. And we're in this together, so we need help. And we need help with the city attorney's office in doing a lot of those functions, in negotiating a lot of those agreements. We need help with all the different departments to do more with less. And that's where we're at, as we're going to hear from our CAO. We were just downgraded on one of our bonds. Again, it's going to cost millions of dollars because we're not making the changes that our bond rating agencies, as we just discussed before we opened it up for public comment. We're not making those changes, the structural long-term changes, not using things that are being talked about, like rainy day funds, that's one-time money. And then the bond rating agencies come in, things like that, and say, well, it was one-time money, you didn't fix the structural problem. So we really do need to look at this together. So I do welcome the ideas that Mr. Koretz and Mr. Rosendahl brought up, as well as our chairman. We've got to get people engaged in the conversation and dialogue and make the sacrifices so we can keep the jobs here as well, so we can keep what I consider you guys our core function, our partners in public safety. We need that balance. And so I do appreciate the time, Chairman, that you gave.
Thank you very much. And just, again, for clarification, there has been no downgrade due to the fact of what we have done. That had to do with general economic circumstances, but it does demonstrate our vulnerability to significant costs if we don't continue to stay on that right course. So, all right, so let's go to Mr. Santana now to present the FSR in its entirety. And for those of you who aren't going to stick around, again, thank you very much for coming down. Thank you for your service to our city.
And if I may, just for the committee, we did release an addendum report just for informational purposes on the 209 position. So hopefully everyone has a copy.
I couldn't hear you.
We did release an addendum report late last week that shows the listing of the positions. Hopefully everyone has it. If not, we can make sure we get copies.
Good afternoon again, Miguel Santana, CAO. We do have a brief presentation that you should have a copy of, and there's copies in the front of this room if folks in the audience would like to receive one. We started off the FSR sort of reminding both your committee, the council, and the larger public of the difficult work that in fact the city has engaged in. It's actually quite an impressive list of various difficult decisions that your council has made over the last 3 years, many of them in partnership with labor. Among them are a contribution towards retiree health care, where the majority of city employees are now contributing, with the exception of the city attorneys and the operating engineers. We've eliminated over 5,000 positions in the civilian workforce, the smallest workforce since 1993. We reduced the starting salary of police officers by 20%. We eliminated departments. We partnered with nonprofit organizations to run animal shelters and are looking at other partnerships. And just last week, you adopted a new pension tier for any new hire that will save us over $4 billion over the next 30 years. This, among other initiatives that you have led, has resulted in the reduction of the structural deficit from well over $1 billion to now about $216 million. But what our report clearly demonstrates is that, unfortunately, there's still a number of difficult decisions to be made. So I'll walk through the presentation and talk about the FSR in context of the next few years that we'll be facing, because the decisions that you make today will ultimately impact the next 24 months. It is true that your budget anticipated the elimination of 209 positions effective January 1st. And to clarify, those positions were not fully funded. They were funded for half a year, not for the entire year. Since that time, we've been working with the CLA and with departments throughout the city to try to reduce that number as much as possible. As of today, of the 209 positions, there's 185 that are filled. And we anticipate that in working with the police department and animal services and a few other departments that are impacted, that number will continue to drop. The reason we are raising this issue now is because we think it's important to alert departments as soon as possible that in order to maintain and start reducing next year's structural deficit, action needs to be taken so they could begin the process of trying to preserve as many jobs as possible over the next 2 months. The worst case scenario would be to wait until mid-December or the last meeting of your Budget and Finance Committee and alert departments at that time that these positions have to be eliminated, giving them little time to prepare to reduce the number of layoffs. It is our goal to actually bring the number of actual layoffs to the smallest number possible. And we've seen, just in the release of the FSR, that departments are starting to respond as the police department is. So again, we hope to see that number decrease in a very quick way. The reason why this is important is that we're currently facing a deficit of $16.6 million. That deficit is throughout the city, including in the city attorney's office, in the police department, in the fire department, and a few others. It provides overall a small percentage of the overall general fund, but when we have very little wiggle room, when we still haven't reached the 5% reserve fund, which you've set as a priority, we must confront those issues now as opposed to waiting till later. And so in light of that deficit, and in light of the fact that there are two major sources of funding that were anticipated in this budget that we still have not fully received. The first is the reimbursement of CRA dollars that we were hoping to receive. We received a significant portion of it, but there's still a gap in what we ultimately had budgeted. And we had anticipated in receiving reimbursement for ambulance transport in October, and unfortunately have not received that. We did ask our Revenue Inspector General to do a top-to-bottom analysis of when we're likely to receive that. And if we do not meet major milestones by the end of this calendar year, he reports that it's very unlikely we will receive it at all this fiscal year. And so we could certainly have Fernando come up and explain that. If these positions are not eliminated, our structural deficit for next year will increase by $216 to $232 million. And so the actions, unfortunately, are necessary to be able to control that. On page number 3, it shows you again what that structural deficit looks like. As I stated, 216 on July 1st of next year. It increases to 327 in year 14-15, and then starts slowly reducing down at 297 in 15-16, and then down to 265 million in 16-17. So unfortunately, our structural deficit lingers between $200 and $300 million over the next few years. The only way of reducing it is by reducing expenditures and increasing revenues. And so the context of our recommendations in whole, not just as it relates to the FSR, is to ask the public to support a new revenue source, but at the same time maintain control over our expenditures. These projections do not include two major factors. The first is that we'll start experiencing a significant reduction in state and federal funding for street services. About $40 million of state and federal dollars that have maintained our program so that we continue to pave streets is expected to be eliminated next fiscal year. And we're starting to see the impact of that now and why we're needing to restore some funding in street services. Currently, we do not have any specific strategy in terms of how to deal with that $40 million reduction. It would mean an additional impact to the general fund if we would maintain the program at the current level. The other issue is that we are anticipating increased costs in the fire department. Preliminary numbers show that for next fiscal year, there'll be an additional cost of $30 million to simply meet obligatory changes. So in light of those two significant unknowns we're anticipating, these numbers are likely to increase. We'll know the final deficit projections once the budget is released, and we'll have a preliminary assessment in our mid-year FSR that reflects whatever changes are done within both lasers and the sworn pension systems. Now, there's been some discussion about our recommendation for the Budget Stabilization Fund, or the Service Protection Account as we really see it as. And if you look at page 5, we show why establishing an account to protect services is so important. Next year, in the context of a $216 million deficit, And in light of the fact that we've done so much to get the deficit to be that number, with few other options left, we think that we need to start the year with some cushion, some one-time source of funding that helps us resolve the entire budget deficit. And so we are recommending that on top of the reserve fund, which should be locked in at 5%, that we establish a service protection account and set as a goal $40 million, so that when you start the new fiscal year and begin your lengthy deliberations over the budget, you already have an ability to close a portion of that gap. Beyond that, you could see that we also need a new revenue source. And we've proposed a documentary transfer tax. Tomorrow, you ultimately will make a decision as to which narrow down the various revenue sources to consider, where we believe that at minimum, we need to get at least $80 million, but obviously, the decisions that you select will impact what this wheel looks like. But in order to be able to close next year's deficit, in addition to the service protection account, we also need about $80 million of new revenue. Now, the other next big portion is, fortunately, the economy is slowly recovering, and we're anticipating that there'll be a modest growth in all of our revenue streams. And at this point in time, we're prepared to project about $50 million of additional revenue that could be used to help reduce that deficit. We also anticipate, at the direction of ERC, saving about $12 million for healthcare savings for next fiscal year. You know, we got a preview of how difficult that's going to be as we discuss healthcare this year. Next year will be equally as challenging, and we're hopeful that with the issuance of a new RFP to select a new provider, and with cooperation from Kaiser, which really is the driver behind those costs, that we'll be able to hit that target. And then finally, even with all of those solutions, we still can't close our deficit. So it's going to be difficult to avoid any additional reductions. And so at this point, we're recommending that no more than $34 million be identified through additional reductions for next year. Ideally, that number goes down. If you pick a revenue source and it passes that is more than 80 million, we would recommend you replace that revenue source, you replace those reductions with that new revenue source. But identifying the one that we have recommended, you see how we get to an entire ultimate deficit reduction plan. So what happens if you don't have that service protection account? It means that the number of department reductions of 34 million increases to 74 million, which unfortunately the equivalent is 900 positions. It's very difficult to imagine where we would make such dramatic cuts throughout the city, a city that's already been cut to the bone in every single department, including the city attorney's department. I think that the testimony that's been made has been absolutely correct. Now, this is the optimistic projection here, because what it assumes is that you're actually getting a new revenue source. And so we'll have a sense as to where the voters are in November to see how they support the governor's plan. But we still have, if we do not get this new revenue source, we're talking about a much higher number of position reductions throughout the city. And I've stated before, and I'll say it again, that I don't see how we avoid making dramatic cuts in public safety without that new revenue. So the overall plan, based on what's before you today, is about today, and in fact it is raining outside as it was stated. But unfortunately, we know that the storm is going to get much worse just months from now. And so what we're proposing is a structure, a framework to start dealing with the deficit that just looms a few months away. Now, if those decisions aren't made, then that problem only becomes bigger. The the decision ultimately, our recommendation regarding the city attorney positions is in direct response to having to eliminate the furlough program. We've been furloughing city attorneys now for 3 consecutive years. They're the only bargaining unit left in the entire city of Los Angeles that is experiencing imposed furloughs. And it's an option that has allowed the department to continue, but based on litigation, and you'll have a closed session discussion on that tomorrow as a full council, we are recommending that the furlough program end in its entirely effective January 1st. And as it was stated, the only other option we then have to not dip into the reserve fund and not make our deficit for next year bigger is to eliminate positions. And unfortunately, that does mean 50 positions. Now, there is the third alternative, and the third alternative, we're hopeful, is that through a mediation process that we're going through right after Thanksgiving, we'll be able to come with an alternative plan that mirrors much of what we've been able to do with the management attorneys. The management attorneys have made a commitment to contribute towards retiree health care of the 4%. They received no COLA in fiscal year 12-13, no salary adjustment, no cash payment. They've committed to pay 5% towards premium health care and have accepted 7 unpaid holidays. And so that framework has allowed us to avoid furloughing the management attorneys. And so through the settlement process, we hope to come up with an alternative so there are no layoffs and no furloughs starting January 1st. Without being able to do so, however, does mean that we have to maintain a balanced budget and proceed forward with layoffs. So the specific recommendations in the FSR is, number one, is to maintain that commitment to the 5% policy of the reserve fund. We're as close to that as we have been over the last 10 years. It's currently at 4.94%. And you've seen in every single report that we receive from the bond rating agencies why that's important. It's just once we hit that 5%, which you've worked very hard to do, very difficult decision to do so, to lock that in. We are recommending that we end furloughs in the city of Los Angeles effectively January 1st, with the hope that we reach some kind of mediation through with the city attorneys. But if we do not, to proceed forward with 50 position eliminations in the department to ultimately maintain a balanced budget at the end of the year. That will be ongoing savings, which would actually reduce next year's deficit down to $205 million, because as you know, furloughs are a one-time solution and position reductions are an ongoing solution. So it does provide us an ability to reduce next year's deficit. There is no specific action that's required to move forward on the elimination of the 209 positions. That was done in your budget. And so it's my understanding, and speaking to the mayor's office, they will instruct various city departments to proceed with that process. Again, the objective here is to have departments go through the specific list that they're faced with and try to find alternative positions that are budgeted for elimination that are also vacant, so that we ultimately reduce the number of layoffs to the very bare minimum, ideally bring it down to 0. We also are recommending that you establish a goal of a $40 million service protection account as part of the budget stabilization fund. This will not be an easy thing to do. It means that any new revenue that comes in should go into that account to help deal with the projected deficit that we're facing. Specifically, as it was discussed on the issue of encumbrances, we think, as we do every year, we go through an exercise to identify any unnecessary encumbrances, and normally those dollars go to the reserve fund. In this case, assuming that we hit the 5%, we are recommending that it go into the budget stabilization fund to avoid future layoffs on July 1st of next year. There are specific actions that do have some urgency. They include the SPRF Hollywood Highland project. It's an SPRF payment related to the Hollywood and Highland needs to be made by October 31st. The ultimate settlement that we reached has a penalty of 7% interest for any day that goes beyond the 31st, and so we need to move forward on that. We negotiated that, and so it's important to be able to meet that obligation. We do have a one-time expenditure as it relates to the White Point landslide of $1.4 million. This is, as you know, in the San Pedro area. It's the first of many dollars that are going to go to ultimately address that issue. We do need $662 million for street services, again in response to a reduction of funding that's taking place. And then finally, to reimbursement for the cost of Operation Healthy Streets. As you know, that was a program that was done to clean up Skid Row, and it was expensive because we were ordered by the courts to be mindful of the property that many of the homeless individuals in that area have. So with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was $662,000.
No, I'm sorry.
Street services. Don't give me a heart attack. All right, so Mr. Rosendahl, why don't we start with you, because I know you're short on time.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I really appreciate how you run these meetings and the openness of the whole process. It's really great. Look, I have a problem with the police department getting rid of civilians. If there weren't right now 100 officers sitting at civilian desks, and I predict you get rid of those 100-plus spots, there'll be other cops. So this magic number of 10,000 officers is a farce if they're not doing police work. And if they're out in the trenches doing police work, that's what we wanted that number for. So I think our mayor has to look at his numbers from the standpoint of the reality of what it will do. I have asked the chief of police, who's been in charge of this, one of the number, a 3-star, what's the deal? And I hear that we still have 100 able-bodied officers in civilian jobs. Now, I know we have another 100 who have disabilities, and I don't blame us putting them in a civilian job. But we already have 100 taking up jobs at civilians who make 70 cents on the dollar, and if this goes through, you'll see another 100 in the same position. So our mayor needs to talk about the number of officers needed to do the job to keep our city safe, not the number of people in the uniform. So I will never support that, and I will stay strong on that through the process. And for the city, I don't really want to be emotional, but, it just drives you nuts after a while when you see an able-bodied officer doing a civilian job and it's 70 cents on the dollar. Look, I love our cops. They do a great job for me. Safety is our number one concern. But sitting in a civilian job is not safety. And this will mean another 100-plus dressed officers, healthy officers, sitting in a civilian job. So I cannot do that. And with the city attorneys, I got to have a lot more appreciation of how we're not going to cut off our nose to spite our faces to get rid of people that are actually prosecuting crimes, bringing in revenue. Look, I sit on this committee now for over 7 years. And I come from the private sector, too. I'm not just a politician in the sense that they use negatively these days. But you got to find this in a more honest way, and it isn't the number, it's the reality. City attorney, I don't blame the city attorney for being upset over this. Look, even the opponent of his running for this feels the same way. I would rather the city attorney's office help us to get in more revenue, like they're doing, and try to leave them alone. So I know it's a tough spot, and Miguel, you get the whipping boy, but you're not the whipping boy. It's the mayor that should start focusing on this from a different perspective. I've never said before 10,000 wasn't a magic number. But when I finally pushed it to the degree where we know 100 able-bodied officers are now sitting in jobs, so it's a no-brainer. There'll be another 100 sitting in those jobs. It's just wrong, and we got to come up with a better strategy. Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chair, for letting me speak like that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rosendahl. Mr. Englander.
Oh, thank you. On page 5, if you could walk us through this a little bit. It's making some assumptions here, a lot of assumptions, and I just wanted to
to get the thinking and what's behind the numbers. On the left side on the pie chart, it says potential solutions for the 13-14 deficit of $216 million with service protection account. So this is the $40 million service protection account you're talking about. You're still talking about on 13-14, with that deficit in mind, 425 additional position eliminations. Is that correct?
Unfortunately, yes. So this assumes that you agree to place the documentary transfer tax on the ballot and that it passes. So
I was going to get to that because it also has a huge part of that.
And it's the proposal that we've laid out, which is a tiered program. So assuming that passes, assuming we get $50 million of just growth in our revenue because of the economy is improving, and we get $12 million of savings, we still don't have enough to close the entire gap. And so the only thing left at that point is to make further reductions. And so that would be the value of about 425 positions, or the $34 million to do so.
And so that's assuming, and those are, and right now with the documented transfer tax proposal, the healthcare savings proposal and estimates, and hopeful of economic growth of up to 3%. With all of those, the best case scenario is what you're suggesting. It's projected that we won't be walking into an addition. Now, the 425 positions that would be eliminated, that's on top of the 209 that's being talked about?
That is correct.
For this year, that's already been approved for this year?
That is correct.
And if we didn't do the 40 million, we're looking at 900 positions?
That is correct.
Do we have a projection that if economic growth was stagnant and the doc transfer tax didn't pass, do you have those numbers on what it would be with and what it would be without the service protection account? Or not yet?
Well, I mean, we're trying to be optimistic here, but without the new revenue source, we're talking about at least another 900 to 1,000 positions. And then if let's say the economy were to start slowing down again, then you're talking about at least another 500 or so positions. So it's obviously the city.
And that's being an optimist.
Well, that's assuming there's that many positions that we could identify for reduction. I mean, that when 70% of your budget goes to public safety, fire and police, then it is impossible to make, a couple of thousand reductions in civilian positions. Impossible. I mean, every department, including my own, has been cut by 20% at minimum. And so we're now talking about a significant reduction in public safety departments. That's the only way of being able to ultimately close the gap that we're facing for next year. On the economic growth, signs are showing that's very likely. It's a combination of both, those taxes that are increasing. We're seeing growth among our TOT. We're having a record number of visitors. Our property tax is stable and showing steady growth, not enormous growth, but steady growth. Sales tax is slowly improving. Where we are seeing some reductions is in the utility user tax. That continues to go down. And so from that standpoint, we're hopeful, assuming that the economy continues on the path it's in, that we'll at least be able to generate the $50 million.
Okay, and I wanted to, just so before I know we're going to go through some of the departments, but before Mr. Rosendahl left, one of the things that he talked about, Bill, I'm going to ask you for support on this in a second.
Yeah.
But can we get an actual analysis on the report of the idea, not just the financial impact, because I want to see those numbers as well, but if we're talking about, and just going to PD for just 1 second, 159, I believe, was the number of positions, civilian layoffs proposed in PD, what that would mean in both the financial impact to the department in terms of having sworn officers who oftentimes are paid double that to do that same job, And then also, I think we need to do at least some type of quick analysis before we pull that trigger. In talking to a lot of the staff, the command staff, as well as captains and others, that said this goes beyond the number, the dollar amounts. There's the folks that are the sworn, love our sworn officers, but these civilians, the sworn officers aren't even trained to do half of what, believe it or not, the civilians at half the price are doing. Whether those are station funding, audits, whether it's the timekeeping, there's a lot of things that have taken years of training that if they're gone tomorrow, the officers being pulled off the street at double the cost just can't do. They're not trained to do it, and we're going to run into all kinds of issues, and they don't have the bodies to do it. And so I think we need a quick analysis of that before that I know we've already voted on that. This whole package has actually been voted on in the budget. It was approved. Then we need to look at that a little closer and really make that determination.
And I'll enthusiastically second it.
We'll be happy to do that analysis prior to January 1st. I know that we did look at that specifically when we compared the cost of manning our jails with sworn officers versus those civilians.
The difference here, though, is these are the civilians that are actually in the jobs running the stations. These are the people who are actually running the stations, checking on the court calendars, doing all the things that the officer support needs to be done. And literally, quite literally, and because these are mandated responsibilities, the officers will just simply be pulled out of the street and out of control. That's the bottom line, just to do the same job. And it's going to be and they're not trained to do it. And so we really have to analyze that prior to January, as soon as possible. How quickly? The question is, how quickly can we get that to come back? And if the positions, if you'd like for that analysis, ask the chair if you'd like that to come back to budget, or if you'd like public safety just to look at it. I'm open to either one, but I think we really need to look at that quickly.
I think both committees should look at it. I'm actually going to propose some alternatives or analysis of alternatives as well. So I think a review of the service impacts will be a necessary part of that discussion. So I support you in wanting to have that analysis done, certainly before it's time to actually initiate the layoffs that have already been budgeted. But let's keep in mind, the budget as it stands right now assumes these layoffs as of January 1. So if we're going to redirect it to other positions, that's an alternative we should perhaps look at. But if we're going to eliminate them, that's going to mean either a cost reduction or a revenue increase in some other area because it's already been budgeted, or furthering our deficit. So
I just want to bring that up by Mr. Rosendahl.
I agree with you. And Mr. Rosendahl actually asked, and maybe this is a segue, Mr. Rosendahl, do you still want to have LAPD's representatives respond to your questions now, or would you like to wait since we're going to have that analysis done? Or, I mean,
Well, the chief's in the room, and I'd just like to ask her a couple of quick questions. There are no surprises. We've been very candid with each other and very strong with each other on this issue. And I just want this in this public forum to be clear. I'm losing my attractiveness to 10,000 sworn officers if these sworn officers are not in the field doing what we put a person in a uniform for. They get in harm's way. My captain, John Peters, is the best I've ever had, how he interacts with the community. Charlie Beck has given me a great chain of command. I'm very proud and very pleased. But last time we had this interaction, I got the impression that we presently, right now, have 100 healthy sworn officers doing civilian jobs. And if we take these civilian jobs the same direction, there will be more sworn officers. So it's a joke. This 10,000 is a magic number of nothingness, if in fact they're not doing police work. And to replace a civilian who's either 50 cents less than the dollar or 70 cents less than the dollar, that plays a critical role, as Mr. Englander said, in processing things and doing things that maybe even a sworn officer wouldn't know what to do. But for me, it's offensive to have a magic number when in fact it's not magic in the field. It's the field we care about, where issues do happen. Are we still, Chief, what you said last time, which looks like 100 right now are able-bodied officers and another 100 aren't able-bodied, but that's cool. They're doing what you would do if you weren't able-bodied.
Well, it's a complicated question, as you well know. Right now, we have 97 sworn officers working the jails. That's the best number we can give you, so it's very close to 100, as you say. We have at least 100 other officers who are not able-bodied at this time. Some permanent light duty that we grandfathered in several years ago, as you know. Some people who are coming back light duty and trying to recover to become full duty. So it is complicated in that regard. But to answer specifically, we have 97 sworn officers in the jail that we did not have in the jail at least 2.5 years ago before the difficulties with the financial crisis started. In terms of the dollars and cents, I've told you, explained before, but I'm not saying that we would rather not have sworn in the jail. They are cheaper right now because of the 20% cut that Mr. Santana talked about, but they don't remain cheaper, as you know, because over time they start to get their step raises and such. One of the things we understand, and I've actually met with Mr. Englander regarding the need to have structural changes within the department that are long-term wins. As Mr. Santana stated earlier, we were slotted originally for over 200 layoffs. We worked overtime, and as of today, it's at 154. However, we've continued to work with people, positions that were fully funded, with people who have left since July 1, and we're hoping to continue to minimize that number. So our goal is not to ever lay off all these bodies. While we look at this from that perspective, that allows us to address the issues specifically that all of you are very concerned with and make small moves every time we lose an individual. How do we adjust so we don't put a full-time sworn employee in that position? To be totally honest, we don't know the entire impacts. And even if you ask us to do an assessment, and we will work closely with the CAO's office when that's done, until a position is gone, we really will not know for sure what all of the impacts will be. So I have to tell you that straight up. But we will continue to work and provide you as best of our assessment with the CAO's office of what those impacts would be.
We'd also like to see, as part of that is a cost-benefit analysis on the types of functions they're doing now. That we do know. And so I think that needs to be part of, if it could be, not just an immediate impact, but a 5-year projection, because obviously if we didn't have certain classes starting, it costs more for that first-time hire, for that initial hire, than it does ongoing. So we'd have to see from a cost-benefit analysis on what...
For the training purposes, for example?
Training purposes as well, we'd have to look at that. So if we forego a couple of classes of hiring to keep civilians, yes, it's got a financial benefit. Year one, it's going to be bigger. But what does it look like going out 2 or 3 years to keep those civilians in place? So we've got to look at some of those real numbers.
And then the final piece, just so I can make sure I address all of the questions that were asked of me regarding the 10,000 number. It's a tough number, but actually 10,400 was set by all of you several years ago as what it would take to properly police the city. As you know, we're really at this point today aren't looking at 10,000. We're really at 9,963, but with the transition of OPS, then that number certainly will go up because we can't lose those positions that OPS are. So that's why I say it's very complicated. We'll continue to work with you all, answer your questions as openly as we possibly can, and continue to try to work with the CAO to save every civilian position we possibly can save, understanding that there's very few structural changes that can be made within the police department or some of the other departments you've talked about today without changing the number of actual people on the payroll. And so that is why we've been working with the CAO recently on shifting as people leave, retire, go to proprietaries, get fired in some cases, to transition, say if somebody who's in an actual seat in our department and swap, so to speak. And we do believe with the city, with our police department, that what we're doing right now to try to minimize how many people actually get laid off We think if we can continue to work this plan, because we do save, we've found ways to save money throughout the year, as you all know, that we can support this and continue to basically give up somebody who left the department and keep somebody who's still with us. And that's what our overall goal will be as we work forward, going forward on this. It's a difficult situation. We are looking at literally shutting down records units in bureaus. It's because we can't put, as I think Mr. Englander talked about, we can't train police officers to do some of the things, or it's certainly not cost efficient to do it. So we're looking at doing some centralization to try to avoid putting any sworn officers in a civilian position. And I can tell you, none of this is easy, and none of it is what we would like to do, but we also understand the devastating financial report that's before us today, and we need to work together with all of you as much as possible to do what's right for the city.
Well, God bless you, Chief. You're fantastic. I appreciate everything you just said. And thank you, Mr. Chairman.
My
It's okay,
pleasure.
I'd like to leave.
Absolutely, absolutely. Be well. Thank you very much, Mr. Rosendahl. Mr. Kretz, you have questions for police while we're here, or?
I don't know if I have questions. I probably more have comments. I think we've had a couple of problems in the department fiscally. One is civilianization makes fiscal good sense, but because we have this, I think, questionable commitment to 10,000 officers, I agree with Mr. Rosendahl, and I've objected for several years. We hire civilians, but then we lay them off, rather than having civilians take the positions that civilians should be taking and officers doing the work that they should be doing. The one thing I've never seen any proof of anywhere is that the 1,000 or so officers that we added was ever fiscally sustainable, ever, even in good times. We built a hole into our budget that we never, ever had the money for. It's a desirable thing. Certainly the department has done better because of it, but we never had a way to do it. I think and this started obviously before I came here, I think we just imagined that we could and said, this is a good thing, let's do it. We could have just as easily said, okay, let's go for 12,000 officers, and we would be bankrupt right now. But it would be just as hard for anyone to argue, let's cut them back, because once you add officers to the police department, nobody wants to cut them. But I think at a minimum, right now in our current financial situation, we absolutely should stop training officers. We're not going to lay off hundreds of officers. I don't think anybody has the stomach to lay off officers. But at least if we could stop training and adding to the problem, there are very few departments across the country that are still hiring more police officers. It creates a giant hole, and especially when we still have sworn doing civilian work. I think that's absolutely inexcusable. We should at least stop training and cut back all the ones that are doing civilian work and replace them with civilians. And so if we only had 9,900 sworn officers or 9,875, and we didn't have the magic illusion of 10,000 officers, and we replaced them with the civilians as we should, there wouldn't be any difference in terms of the service we were providing. We'd be providing the exact same service. We'd just be doing the right thing. So that makes no sense to me. How are we doing on all the work that we've been talking about on collections? We have Inspector General on board. He's doing the work.
If Mr. Kretz, if you could, if I could just finish up with PD first, and then they can go, and then we'll move on to that, if you don't mind. Anything else for PD?
Just a comment for our colleagues to think about.
Okay, thank you. Mr. England.
I think we're all thinking about that. I think we're all on the same page on that, or most of us anyway. Couple things. On the OPS consolidation costs, I don't see that in here on the total cost that we've come up with on what it's going to cost to transfer equipment and vehicles and
I think in the context of the last discussion we had on that, the department has stated that they would be able to absorb most of the additional costs associated with the transfer. If there's any,
Yes, I don't have all the numbers sitting in front of me, but in terms of the vehicles coming over and maintenance of those vehicles, we believe we can absorb the cost. The only issue that we've been working with the CAO's office is the amount of money that was transferred over, and then we didn't get the bodies that, at the time, and they're working on that for the
I think
mid-year report.
what I was looking at is, when I had a discussion with the department about the numbers, and they said it's anywhere between 2, could be 3 million. There were things that were being identified, and there was a work plan and a budget determined at the time. And I was also told that those spreadsheets were in fact done, and they were going to be dropped off to me. I just never received them from the department. But even if it's 3 or 4 million, whatever those numbers are, if they were going to be absorbed in the department, what I look at is when departments are going to absorb things of this nature, whether it's 3 or 4 or 5 million, whatever those dollars are, it's still money that we fund the department. It comes out of the general fund at some point. It's not grant-funded money. So do you have the total numbers? Do we have the spreadsheets for that yet?
Jason Glean, Office of the CEO. We're working with Maggie Goodrich on developing how much money it would cost to actually tie in the OPS infrastructure to the LAPD infrastructure and doing the technology tie-ins. But as Chief MacArthur stated, the cost of moving the fleet over has already been absorbed, and we're in the process of doing that. The $2 to $3 million in savings that were identified in the initial report were tied to the elimination of the July class. So we did achieve those savings.
Yes, I understand that. Can I see a financial report? Can that come forward?
Yes.
I requested it from the department. I was told I was going to have it before this discussion.
That's a report from the CAO's office, correct?
Well, I was told the department put the numbers together.
We'll be happy to
numbers, but
we'll work together.
Of course, we're almost done with it. I just want to see the numbers. That's
Okay.
Great. Thanks. And then the other question I had on it wasn't stated on page 41 on the decline in OPG revenue. Is there a report on how much? It just says that there was a decline. I didn't see an amount.
We did get the numbers from the commission, and the OPG revenue year-to-date is 2.8 million, and it is down from what was projected in the budget.
Down how much? I'm sorry.
Just a minute. I may have to get back to you with that.
Okay. If we could.
I'll report that.
Thanks. I'd appreciate it. I'll just make a note of that. And then my last question on the issue on 40, we're finally on the FSR putting in all the cameras that have been purchased and funded and identified for the installation throughout the city. And my only question on that is more of a policy one, but it was supposed to come back to public safety on a camera policy on the types of equipment. We've had discussions about that, and I haven't yet seen the department put out a policy. If they have, I haven't seen it yet, on working with ITA, and ITA was going to be the ones to determine the policy in terms of what cameras are IP, and I don't want to go through all the details. I just wanted to find out what the status was. We're going through. There was also issues that were brought up in budget and in public safety, that some of the contracts are different, the vendors have different warranties, and so there was going to be some standardization, because what happens often is we get the cameras installed and then they don't work, and we have a false sense of security to those communities. We have to go identify additional money to go fix them. So we've run into that problem. So we've had this discussion ongoing, and I have yet to see a policy come back.
Well, part of the problem is, as you know, ITA is responsible for some things, and then the police department's responsible for others, and trying to coordinate a city policy is not necessarily always an easy thing to do. You're talking about the policies on who's to maintain them and how long that the maintenance agreements are for and things like
Well,
that?
there was a lot of issues, and it was PD that said that they were the ones working on the lead agency, if you will, or lead department, are going to work on the policy with ITA. But PD would take the lead on developing, because they're the end user, the type of cameras, what they should and shouldn't do, all of those issues that were going to be developed into a...
I'll get back to you on that, but part of the issue is trying to work with ITA, who is another department, and they don't have to necessarily work with us on a policy.
So can PD be the lead agency in coming up with the policy on...
We can take the lead with working with ITA on it and coming back to you and reporting back on see if we can come up with a policy that's consistent, and I think that's what you're asking for.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Anything further, Mr. England? Okay. So that does it for PD. Thank you very much. Now, Mr. Kretz, you wanted to move next to collections. I don't know if I have seen Mr. Campos. Is Mr. Campos here? Oh, there he is. Okay. So, Mr. Kretz.
Yeah, my question is, how much have we improved collections, and are we capturing the improved dollars in our budget calculations?
We are improving in our collections function. Fernando Campos with the Inspector General CAO's office. Glad to be here. Good afternoon. We are improving on our collections. I've been working with the Department of Transportation, the Housing Department, Office of Finance, also with the Police Department and Fire Department to improve our collection rates. Currently, the numbers and improvement for our Transportation Department are built into the budget. Approximately $4 million are reflected in the budget. In addition to that, we are looking at improving our ambulance billing collections by about 2%. That number is being built in and has been built into the budget. So we are in line with our projected budget. Now, there is a portion of the ambulance billing that is associated with AB 678, which is what Mr. Santana mentioned earlier, that is at risk if we do not hit the milestone of December 31st, 2012. Just to briefly give you an overview of where we are with that AB 678, we have been working with a beta group with the fire department and also with 6 other municipal governments in submitting a state plan amendment. This amendment would amend our state plan Medicare reimbursements that the state of California could receive funding for medical transports. The process is approximately 11 steps. We are currently in step number 5. Just to give you an idea of where we are, the major critical milestones is the December 31st date with the amendment of the state plan. If we do not have that state plan amended, at least at draft form submitted to the state or the federal government for approval, the likelihood of that money coming in before the end of the fiscal year would be greatly diminished. At this point, I am recommending a couple of things for the fire department. One is to do an all-hands-on-deck exercise to have all the documents and all of the necessary data to be ready to submit to the state government for reimbursement by the end of this calendar year. In addition to that, we are recommending to move forward in a one-claim submission packet. Now, I am pleased to report that as of last week, the fire department was able to confirm that we are moving in this direction already. So what you see in Transmittal 14 is 4 case scenarios in which that money may come or may not come by the end of the fiscal year. Scenario A and B are no longer going to be our scenarios simply because we are no longer submitting the 2-claim process. We are now going to submit only 1 claim for the entire claim period. So that means that we will get 1 check for $23 million as opposed to 2 checks, one for 13 and another for $10 million. So in terms of the critical milestone, as Mr. Santana mentioned, December 31st is the date that we will be looking closely, and I'll be monitoring and working with the fire department to ensure that we have the documents ready for submission, and then 2, that we have at least a draft for the state plan amendment to submit to the federal government for consideration.
So we're anticipating that we shouldn't need to miss that deadline.
That is my hope. My hope is to have everything in together by December 31st. However, towards the end of December, if that deadline is not met or we experience some delays between now and then I would report back to this committee to give you an update along with the fire department.
It's important to point out that this is not being done exclusively by the city. It's in coordination with all other cities throughout the state that are seeking reimbursement. So it's not a criticism of our department. The department is working as quickly as it can, but we're also having to be at the same pace as other jurisdictions. And so that's the reason why we state the cautionary note on that.
Can we help drive those other jurisdictions as well?
We have been.
We are one of 6 municipal governments that are part of this beta group. Just to give you some idea as to how many public entities can apply for this reimbursement, we have about $80 million set aside for this Medi-Cal reimbursement. About 170 to 180 public entities provide public medical transport. Those are the entities that are going to be eligible to apply for this $80 million. We are one of the 6 in the beta group that's testing the process, so we are fortunate to be in that beta group. Therefore, we will be one of the first municipal governments to receive that reimbursement. If everything goes fine with the pilot program, then that would be extended to the entire state of California, whoever is eligible for apply.
And how about our changes on parking tax collections? I know there must be 5 or 10 steps to maximizing that. How are we moving on that, and what do we think will...
We're moving in the right direction, not moving as fast as I would like. I do have a report coming out within the next couple of weeks to this committee discussing my findings that I've done over the last several months. The parking citation is one of the top priorities that I'll be working on. There are various approaches that we can take to improve collections. I am recommending an improvement of 2 to 3% per year to go and increase our collections on the parking citations. For one, we ought to seek and develop some sort of campaign to go after repeat offenders. These repeat offenders are those folks that have 5 tickets or more, and we have approximately over 1,500 individuals on this list. So I'd like to move forward, and I'll be proposing this to this committee in the next couple of weeks in terms of developing a campaign to go after those repeat offenders.
I think you're talking about a different piece of the problem. I'm talking about parking lot operators that are pocketing the money.
Parking occupancy tax as opposed to parking citations.
Yes.
That item has been moving forward. We do have approximately 48 items that I'm tracking related to the parking occupancy tax. Some items have been before this committee and also to the full council to approve a bond that would require new auto park operators that apply for an parking occupancy tax license to have a bond so that in case there is a city liability or they do not pay their liability, that we can go after the bond. Having this in place will tremendously improve our collections. It's approximately 10% of the projected revenues would be posted as a bond in case that auto park does not pay their liability or we find that there's a liability not yet paid to the city, we can go after that bond.
And so what dollar amount do we expect to save this year and next year?
I don't have numbers at this point, but I can tell you that there is approximately about 15 to 16% that has gone uncollected at this point. So we are looking at ways that we can improve. I unfortunately do not have numbers that I can give you. However, with my report, I will be working at those numbers and coming to this committee with the numbers that I've been able to validate. Those that I have not been able to validate, those will be still subject for further analysis.
And obviously, I don't know if we're still going down this road, but we've been talking about possibility of increasing the percentage of parking occupancy tax from 10 to 15%. If we take that approach, obviously, we also want to focus even more on collecting what's due to us and it'll be an extra 33% of that.
Correct.
That's one of the items that you'll discuss tomorrow.
Very good.
And members, there will be a much more detailed discussion of the collections efforts when Mr. Campos's final complete report is back before this committee in about 2 weeks?
Hopefully less. We're trying to coordinate a meeting between the Audits and Governmental Efficiency Committee along with your committee to have a joint committee.
So we'll be scheduling the better part of a meeting just for analysis of those issues. I just wanted to focus a little bit on the AB 678 funding. First of all, I get that we're part of that group with other jurisdictions, but must we be delayed by their delay, or if we're ready to go, can we move forward and let the others catch up?
Unfortunately, we are part of the beta group, so we have to move at the same pace as the rest of our colleagues in the beta group. The main trigger is actually getting the approval of the state plan amendment. Without that amendment, no public agency can apply for that reimbursement.
We can't act in that regard independently of the beta group.
But what we could do is we could exercise, we represent about 35% of this monies that are out there. So we do have representatives from the fire department fire department that are representing in the beta group. We could ask them to move forward. We could explore also options that we can submit a state plan amendment that would allow us to receive the reimbursement, a portion of the reimbursement for what we already know that qualifies under the AB 678 laws. And then afterwards, we can always go back and ask for a secondary amendment for other indirect costs or other costs that we're trying to obtain approval from the federal government. So at this point,
Go ahead.
at this point, what the Veda Group is focusing on is trying to capture all the expenses that are eligible for reimbursement, whether they're direct or indirect, and submit a full package to the state and also to the federal government for approval. We could move in portion. However, at that point, once we submit the state plan amendment, the likelihood of a secondary amendment getting approved at the pace that we're going at and the advancements that we've done in the progress may be delayed.
So it makes logical sense to proceed as you're recommending as part of the Veda Group. I just want to reemphasize the extraordinary importance of getting this done on time, because if we fail to, it's all or nothing now, and if we fail to realize that $23 million in reimbursements in this fiscal year, that's the rough equivalent of the value of all of the layoffs that we're talking about. So the 250 people who are facing layoffs, that's the rough value of that. So if we fail to get that money in by the end of the year, basically you're talking about another 250 layoffs. That's the extraordinary importance of ensuring that we get this done. So I think one of our recommendations is going to be to ensure that that gets done, and we'll get to that when we get to fire. But any other questions on this? Or
Quick question on the
Yeah.
DOT, going back
Fire
to
away.
the parking occupancy taxes and the auto park registration. What we're talking about is the people that have failed to pay and trying to enforce, much like what we've done in the past on business taxes, where I remember a study years ago that was done where it showed we only received about 50% were in compliance in paying the business tax. So then it wasn't a matter of going after the ones who were already paying to make sure they were accurate and audited, although that's done as well, but trying to go after additional collections of all the ones that weren't even filed. And we've done a pretty good job. I'm not sure where we're at now in compliance with businesses, if what the percentages are. Do you have any idea of?
I have a general understanding, but I don't know if the Office of Finance is here that can provide you more detailed. But in terms of parking occupancy,
Where I was going with this is on the POT. We've got a lot of auto parks. In fact, probably the majority of auto parks, quite frankly, from the research that I've done and looked at and working with CID and actually going out on sting operations and learning much more about it. We've got thousands of these throughout the city that aren't permitted at all, that are collecting revenue and POT not paying the POT at all. Oftentimes, they're actually even charging the POT on top of their fee, and they're not paying the city a dime because they're not permitted. And these are, I think there's been estimates that have been thrown out there of upwards of $30 to $40 million in revenue a year, not one-time money, but every single year. These are big dollars. And I'm wondering if you've looked at analyzing any of those at all and have any recommendations on what we should be doing besides some general sting operations where we send folks out once in a while.
yeah, I'm not at the point where I'm doing the deep dive analysis in terms of what monies would actually come from these audits, but I do know that audits are definitely necessary, some sort of operations that we can verify whether these operators are operating legally or illegally, and those that are operating illegally, getting them to register and also collecting the portion that belongs to the city. So in terms of doing the deep dive analysis, I am not there at this point. However, I do know that it is one of my top 10 priorities to do so.
Okay, thank you.
Also seems an appropriate task for the controller to be taking on.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Campos.
If I may, can we go back to the police department? There's actually a request that they have, and I think they'll be happy to come to the table. They'd like to get a reappropriation from the reserve fund for some funding.
Do we have that before?
This was not part of the report, but this is actually a recommendation that they wanted to bring forward.
Good afternoon, Laura Luna, LAPD. When we submitted our information for the FSR, we had requested a reappropriation of some funding. Last fiscal year, the mayor's office needed to purchase some stuff under the UASI 08 grant, but the funds were not available, so they asked us to front those funds, and with the promise that we would get the funds back during the course of the fiscal year so we could respend that same money. Unfortunately, the money didn't come in till the beginning of June, and we weren't able to spend the money because the supply management system was shutting down. So we're asked, the money did come into the budget, into our accounts rather. It was, but it reverted back to the general fund, and now we're asking for it to be reappropriated this current fiscal year. And it was omitted, like I said.
Yeah, so as I understand it too, that the money is needed to actually pay some service agreements that they were unable to pay last year.
It was part of our paying for service agreements associated with the maintenance of our land.
Okay, so with respect, it's 5 o'clock on the day of the hearing of the FSR. Why am I hearing about this for the first time at 7 minutes to 5 this afternoon? I don't have an analysis or a recommendation of this. It's not in the FSR.
No, this was a request that came after the FSR was prepared and released, and so this is an issue that the department would like to bring forward. So it's
I
brought
appreciate
forward.
that, but it's just not acceptable as a matter of process. These, we can't just make recommendations on the fly on the budget. This needs to, if there's a recommendation to be made, I would expect that it would be seen by the CAO, by the CLA, and by me before we show up here to hear the FSR.
We'll be happy to take a look at it and report back at the next meeting.
Okay, so that's what we'll do. We'll go ahead and hold that for the next meeting. Is there a time sensitivity to this that's so great that it can't wait a week? Because we can do it separately. We could act separate from the FSR.
Right.
That's fine. And I don't mean to make a substantive, I mean, we might very well be able to do this very quickly.
Right, yeah.
I just don't want to do it without a moment's thought by anybody.
It was our understanding that the CAO supported this. That's why they brought it up. And it was just a matter of it having been omitted. It was an oversight. But no, it can. We just need to be able to spend the funds. It's to pay for some of our maintenance agreements on our systems. So it can be delayed.
Okay, very good. Then we'll just go ahead and hold that off until next week and
we'll present it
give it
next week.
priority when we next meet.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, members,
Did you want to go back to the departments?
Yes, so we've covered LAPD.
So we starting back with animal services?
Well, no. Oh, animal services wanted to be heard. We didn't call it. Yes, so let's go ahead and bring up animal services.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the opportunity to hear Animal Services today. John Chavez with Animal Services, and I'm here with John Forland. Councilman, we have 8 clerk typists who are on resolution authority. We believe that we have sufficient savings in our budget to pay for those clerk typists without having to lay them off. We need these clerk typists because we're opening up the new South LA shelter. It'd be very difficult for us to operate without having 8 clerk typists in our system. We're taking clerk typists and other employees from throughout our system to staff the new South LA shelter, which is larger. It's actually the largest animal shelter in our system. So we are recommending for consideration by the Budget and Finance Committee that we use our budgeted funds to pay for the clerk typist positions, the 8 that are on resolution authority.
And as we stated in our supplemental report, there are a number of departments that are coming with alternatives to the positions that are currently filled. So we'll be working with those departments in the course of the next several weeks to try to reduce the number of layoffs. So at the face of it, this is like a reasonable alternative, but we'll be looking at it just in the same way we're going to look at PD and other departments that have layoffs.
Okay, so
we'll continue to work with them on alternatives to layoffs, and so this is one department we're going through the same process now with PD and other departments. So no action is necessary, but the goal is again to reduce the actual number of people hitting the street.
Yep. Great. It's a goal we all share. So no action is required.
No action
At this
required.
point, you're going to continue to work with them. Members,
Yep.
any concerns about that? Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for staying. Thanks for your patience.
The next department was building safety. I think there was a question on building
Mr.
safety.
Englander, I think, called Building and Safety. Building and Safety?
Oh, yeah. That was yesterday, wasn't it?
Can I go back then?
How you doing?
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Steve Ongala, Department of Building Safety.
I knew I should have written down my question. I think I wanted to find out some of the things that came out of the budget discussions from the last conversation on where we were at with meeting some of the objectives and goals and plan check and how things were smoothed out. It would be a good opportunity just to get a quick update from the department on.
Councilmember, if I understand you correctly, you are looking for the update on the studies that you asked the department to do during the budget deliberations.
One of the things we'd asked, the department chair asked every department to present their best practices, I want to use your language, best practices to submit to the Budget and Finance team on last year's budget, on where's, particularly as it pertains to other departments, similar cities, and looking at how to streamline initiatives. When we're talking about increasing fees and revenues and taxes or going after existing ones, one of the things I constantly harp on that we fail to speak to is just improving services for the businesses and residents here in Los Angeles to increase revenues, to make us more business friendly. And one of the most important points of contact is building and safety on those issues, as you well know, getting inspectors to sign off on buildings, making sure that there's businesses have certainty, or that when they move here or they open up here, they know how long it's going to take for them to open, and identifying some of those issues. And we know what those concerns were here. We spent a lot of time in this during the budget process, during the deliberations, and asked for the reports back from Building and Safety on exactly that. And then here we are at the FSR, and I still haven't seen anything, unless it just made it to the chair, but I don't think anything's been submitted.
You're correct.
I just want to find out where we were.
You're correct, Councilmember. I want to say that the department took the instruction very, very seriously and actually decided to go above and beyond maybe what was asked for.
They're not traveling around the world to go check best practices.
Not necessarily traveling around the world.
I want to make sure.
I just want to make sure that
not all the way around.
Not all the way around.
That there's an understanding that there are not too many cities that are the size of the city of LA in terms of size and in terms of population. In terms of size, I don't know if there's any that we could compare to. The city of LA, Building and Safety decided to take an in-depth study of what we were asked to do. Talk to California cities. We went to Sacramento. We went to San Diego. Some of the cities that we talked to, we didn't necessarily go there. We talked to some cities in the East Coast, including Chicago, including New York. And what we're doing is trying to put together a very comprehensive report, not just a report for the sake of having a report to show that, yeah, we did our report, but something that at the end of the day will have a meaning to what you really asked for. It is my understanding as well that the Department of Building and Safety has gotten in touch with your office, council member, and give you an update as to when we will be ready with this report. It is my understanding it's going to be ready sometime in mid-November, and that you have been made aware.
I just want to put on the record, it's the third time I've been made aware that it's kicked down the road a couple months at a time. So I just wanted to find out exactly where we are with making sure it was actually getting done.
It is forthcoming. You will be able to see it in mid-November, and and it's going to be a comprehensive report, including best practices from, just to give you a snippet of what we found, not many cities, if any city at all, does the kind of things, innovative stuff that we do in the city of LA, including collection of fees with regard to code enforcement. Most cities fund the entire operation from the general fund, unlike LA, where we're constantly seeing cuts, but we do make a lot of revenue, bring a lot of revenue to the general fund. So there are a lot of good things that you will see in this study, but it is coming.
Great. Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Any more questions?
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Any other questions with the city attorney?
Sorry?
Any other questions with the city attorney?
Mr. Kretz? Yes. Why don't we go ahead and bring the city attorney up?
Yeah, just a question on a proposal that the city attorney and I worked on a couple of years ago. Do we know what the status is of the effort to move forward the ACE program? And do we know, once that's finally moved forward, how much we think we would save the city once it's implemented?
If the question is for me, I can answer that, Councilman. William Carter, Chief Deputy City Attorney. Good afternoon, Honorable Chair, members of the committee. With me at council table is William Mangan, our Chief Budget Analyst. Also, Pete Echeverria is with us. With regard to ACE, the Administrative Citation Enforcement Program, I believe that is currently before this committee. It was released out to the full council. Then it was brought back to this committee last year. We have provided, I believe, Pete, if you're still here, we did provide amended language for the ACE program, which language was proposed by various folks in the community, including the apartment owners and others.
And this committee as well. We addressed a number of points that the committee had raised the last time it considered the matter, and that draft has been provided.
So in terms of costs and revenue for the city, from day one, we recognized that this city was under tremendous budget constraints, and recognizing that we had a system that was either nothing for an LAMC code violation or filing a criminal case, which ends up going to Superior Court and having to deal with a judge. We thought, in working with you, Councilman Koretz, on the ACE program was a great idea. We have the language, we have the proposal. We've calculated that there are probably anywhere between 20 and 25,000 cases a year that this office could refer to an ACE program, that meaning in the pilot program, LAPD and or Animal Services or any other city department that this council approves could enter into this pilot program, could write that citation. And so this office would have the option of either filing a criminal case or letting it run in a citation, and that citation would be paid, or the fine or penalty would be paid directly to the city. That money would go directly to the city, and we calculate anywhere $10 to $15 million a year just on that citation program. Now, we drafted and Building and Safety implemented a mini ACE program last year. We drafted, and the council approved, this mini ACE program, the Building and Safety. Last year alone, they collected $8 million. Just Building and Safety. It's just their violation. So if you impose that citywide, you can do the math. And that's revenue that comes to the city.
So how much, if we just did the pilot program with LAPD and Animal Services, do we have a sense of how much
It'd be
we would
tens of
save?
thousands. What would happen is you would be able to focus your attorneys on more serious cases like the ones you heard our folks talking about. We get a lot of cases that are very important to the community, and the LAPD or others will bring them in, and we have to decide, are we going to file a domestic violence case or a sexual assault case, which is really a rape, but because we can't file a felony, we have to call it sexual assault. or we have a murder, but we can't call it a murder because it's a misdemeanor, so we call it manslaughter. So we file those cases, and then the other cases have to sit on the sidelines, whether they be a code enforcement or a vendor or some other type of drinking in public. But if we have a citation program, we can file those cases. Those will go as separate, non-criminal, and then that will generate revenue. That will save the bodies that we can put on criminal cases and then generate revenue through ACE. It's a win-win. It saves prosecutors to focus on the sexual assault, domestic violence, the DUIs, and then generates revenue with citations, which otherwise would sit there, or if it went through the criminal court system, and by the time it got to the end, a judge imposes a $100 fine, and then that gets split up between the county, the state, and maybe the city. It's just not cost effective.
Well, considering our present finances, I hope we'll try to revive this effort again and calculate some savings that we can capture at least in the next fiscal year.
It's built into our budget. We've asked for it every year. We think it's a great program, and I know, Councilman, we've worked with your staff, Christopher Kuntz and others on it, and we've prepared the amended language.
Thank you.
And Mr. Kretz, I know my staff has had discussions with yours about this and getting it prepared to bring forward, so I'm eager to work with you to try to explore that as an additional option for the city attorney's office.
Thank you.
All right, anything further? Mr. Englander?
I'm prepared to answer any questions.
I know
don't
you
think
are.
I can add to anything that either the city attorney or my colleagues have said in the letter.
We have had a very thorough discussion. We've heard certainly from much of your office and you've provided valuable information, particularly about the impacts, the cascading impacts of the layoffs according to the current layoff plan, which was something, frankly, that I hadn't considered until you submitted that, and the impacts that it would have in other parts of the department. So I think through our meetings and the discussions that we've had with the various attorneys in the office, I think I don't have anything further. But Mr. Santana, I guess maybe you might speak to the layoff impacts. If there's any other information that you have on this, is my understanding that the current layoff plan that's effective for the city attorney's office, if a layoff were to be initiated, was prepared many moons ago. And essentially, because of the different job classifications within the office, it isn't necessarily the most junior lawyer who would get laid off. It's the most recent hired in each job classification, which might include very senior lawyers who might be assigned to particular significant cases right now, which would cause a reconfiguration of the staffing of particular cases, and with the cascading effect of bumping rights and so on. One of my concerns about this, aside from the general concern that we have with any layoff at this point, which is the significant loss of service that we're going to get, the impact I have here is the sort of unknowable impact that we'll have on pending litigation even, and anticipated litigation as we go forward, especially because we have so much concern about trying to contain those costs. So I'd like you to speak to that if you have considered it. If you haven't, we can discuss that at a further time. Before I get to that, the one thing I did want to ask you about is outside counsel expense. We are now at a point where we have blown through our entire outside counsel budget. What can be done? And I guess I already can hear the answer that the reason for that is because you're understaffed. We get it. But going forward from here, we have another we have 3/4 of a fiscal year we still have to get through. What is the plan? What is the strategy for addressing the shortfall that we have in outside counsel funding, since we've already spent it?
If I may, before Mr. Carter addresses any strategy, and frankly, I'm at a loss as to what our strategy will be, because we have reduced outside counsel spending so much in recent years. It's not so much that we've blown through what was a realistic budget estimate, but we've been reducing it so much that this year's appropriation was, from the beginning, something I understood to be underfunded. There was no question about it. And so we're at that point. We are. That combined with a number of actions that have increased our need that we might have otherwise been able to eliminate for outside counsel, including the Ardon case, for example. There are other cases that we have brought to conclusion, and you're aware of them. The Dillingham case was one of them, where we bled in that case so much because of the nature of it and the longevity of it. So we try the best we can. We have, we have a review that we put every outside counsel bill through an analysis and reduce it and send it back and say that we think this is overbilled, that's overbilled, you charge us for this review or that review. We do a fairly meticulous review of those expenditures. We have to come and convince you whenever we need outside counsel. So I don't think that there can be an allegation that we have been exorbitant in our request for that. I think we have managed to convince you that there was a genuine need.
So we're going to have a further discussion about this. I think we have a closed session scheduled for tomorrow, Wednesday, I'm not sure, on this. But as a general matter, I think I've said this multiple times, but I'm going to say it again. Routine litigation for this city should not be done by outside counsel. We should not be using outside counsel for anything that we litigate on a regular basis.
We agree.
And there's always going to be a case, an extraordinary construction defect case in a wastewater treatment plant or something where that's unusual, that you're going to need to hire the best, law firm who has an expertise in that little narrow area. And we're always going to have those cases. And frankly, those are really difficult to budget ahead of time. But I think on a case-by-case basis, it's going to be incumbent upon your office and this committee and the CAO's office to identify those specific matters and be scrupulous on a very periodic, regular basis of assessing the cost of that litigation.
We agree, and we'll work with this committee and with the CAO to be even more strict in our review of those needs. Absolutely.
Great. Thank you, Pete. Mr.
Sure. On the layoff process, you're correct that the city attorney does manage the layoff process for the city attorney's office. And the rest of the city is managed by the personnel department, and it's the charter does specify that it has to be the seniority within the class, and it should be modeled after the civil service process. So there is some general guidelines to avoid or minimize the impact on pending litigation on civil matters. Is the reason why we focused on criminal. But as you stated, there still may be an impact based on the way the layoff process actually gets effectuated. And so we certainly would welcome the opportunity to work with the city attorney's office to minimize that impact on any pending litigation and try to use a level of precision to avoid that kind of negative outcome.
Okay. All right. Anything further, Mr. England, on this? Mr. Kretz?
May I make one comment?
Sure.
Briefly. Thank you. There's an assumption that the city attorney's office is operating over budget. I think the analysis that we look at is that we've been chronically underfunded. And this argument started in July of 2009 when we first got here. And when, in fact, the first FSR, this office was projected to have an $18 million deficit by the end of that year. The year after that, $11 million. We've solved our problems. What's happened is our attrition is going down. It's going off a cliff. We are solving our problem through attrition and other cost-saving measures. But every time this office has tried to get some kind of parity, meaning with its closest partners, LAPD and fire, there's been this attempt to knock us down a notch and then a claim that we're over budget. What's happened is the office has not been fully funded. And every year we've said, fund us to a point where we can sustain ourselves, but then we just keep getting taken down. This issue, I think, will resolve itself. I think this is a precipitous request for a layoff. We've had, you can see in the letter, I don't believe that the furlough issue is something that should be a rush to layoffs. I will not have the advantage of being in closed session tomorrow to discuss it. You can see in our letter that matter is being handled by outside counsel. We are handling our own case on the state side, and we are winning. So it's not something I'm proud about. No one wants to have to furlough employees, but I think it's an appropriate measure. It's the better choice than layoffs. If we can't furlough, then I think this office has to be fully funded. And right now, we're only, and when I mean only, we're talking about a relatively small budget gap of $4.5 million. That number will go lower as we get through the fiscal year with attrition and other cost savings. I don't think we need to rush to layoffs right now. I just don't see the need for it. And there should be other options. We've dug ourselves out of deeper holes. And I know you have tremendous challenges, but I don't think we should rush to layoffs right now. I don't think we need to.
Well, and I appreciate that comment. Obviously, I need to say that every department in the city is underfunded. And when we look at parks that have taken a 35 to 40% cut in the last 3 or 4 years, for example, that has a drastic impact on public safety in our city as well, when our kids who are at risk don't get the services that they need. When there's fewer ambulances in my district than there were before, that has an impact. That kills people. That results in people having, a lower rate of survival. That impacts public safety. So I say this not really to push back, Mr. Carter, but just to put it in the context of the great challenge that the city faces, and to remind people that as everybody who comes before this committee and says that further reductions are going to be impactful on services, everybody who says that is absolutely right. And as Mr. Englander said earlier, put it very well, none of us got elected to do this. None of us chose a career in public service to diminish services to the people of this city. That's the reality of the economic situation that we're facing now. And so this isn't a choice between bad options and good options. This is a choice for at least a couple more years of which are the least bad options. And, I hear you. But I think that's every other department is under budgeted as well. And so we just need to figure out now, how do we provide an opportunity to manage within inadequate budgets? And I think in that regard, Mr. Kretz put this into the context well, I think, of saying that we're in a situation now where furloughs, which would not have been my choice in the first place. I don't think it's a very good option to ask attorneys to be furloughed. We all know the way attorneys work, and that's not necessarily the best strategy, but that's what we had, and now that's been legally challenged, and we may not have that option as one of the tools in our toolkit anymore. But when the vast majority of the money that we're spending out of our general fund is on people, the few options that you have are cutting pay, getting greater contributions to benefits, laying people off, or furloughing. There aren't any other choices than those four. So, if one of those is taken off the table, then we have to get savings realized in one of those other ways. And that's just the place that we're at. And during the pendency of a collective bargaining agreement, we really don't have the options of cutting pays or pay or some of the other things. And by the way, when is, just so that we have this straight in our head as it relates to the fiscal years, when are these bargaining units up for renewal?
They end at the end of this fiscal year for the city attorneys.
So if we don't realize the savings necessary now through the options that are before us, in the next fiscal year, it seems very likely that there would have to be fairly drastic cuts in other ways if we can't resolve this, through a successful strategy right now. That could possibly include actual pay cuts as opposed to, deferring raises and things like that. We may be looking at pay cuts.
That's right.
Mr. Chairman, may I make just one observation? I apologize. I know it's a late hour, but...
No, not at all. It's important. We're here as long as we need to be, and thank you for staying.
The one observation I would make is that the difference in this situation and affecting this particular instance is that we're not talking about an underfunding or an overfunding of the budget or the amount of our budget. We're talking about the method by which we get through the rest of the fiscal year, and it is whether we continue with the furloughs or whether we have layoffs. And I understand that, and all I'm suggesting is that there are other alternatives that can be considered of how to get through either the rest of this fiscal year or for a more permanent solution. The CAO mentioned one of them in his report. We mentioned some in our reports as well. So there is no need to, in my view, to rush to implement the layoffs immediately. They can remain under consideration. I'm not suggesting that they not. That's always an option for the city. But I'm suggesting that other options be explored, since we're not talking about the amount of our budget at this point in time.
I agree, and I think that's going to be part of the recommendation that I make. With regard to the city attorney layoffs that are proposed in the FSR, given the fact that this discussion is really driven by the urgent need to address the budget shortfall in light of the potential change in status of the furloughs, I guess is a way I could put that. And we are having a discussion about the furloughs tomorrow in closed session, members. My suggestion with regard to the layoffs would be that we, with regard to that portion of the FSR, that we advance it to council without recommendation until we have further discussion following the closed session on the furlough situation.
I do have one question on that.
Sure, go ahead.
And I'm fine with that. I agree. Trigger points and dates and times we've got to be cognizant of as well. So in putting off any decision-making or stopgaps in this, and there's been some speakers earlier that said, if it's not until January, make the decision in January or December, because we've gotten out of situations before, whatever that might be. If you could just enlighten us on a time frame, because it takes time to go through processes as well. So, Mr. Santana, if you could just speak to that quickly.
Sure.
Very briefly.
Yes, the reason we recommended moving forward with the layoffs now or the position elimination is to allow the department time to prepare for that process. So the recommendation effectuates them on January 1st. It's also a recommendation that the furloughs be ended at that time.
Are there other departments involved, like personnel?
No, the city attorney manages his own furlough layoff process. So that's, they get some advice from the personnel department, but they're unique in that they manage their own process.
Okay, but all the other ones that we're talking about for the other departments?
Right, the other departments are managed exclusively by the personnel department.
Right. Mr. Krebs?
Yeah, I just want to point out at least my own opinion that everything is complicated by the fact that when we lay off 50 city attorneys, there's a pretty good possibility that we actually have a net loss in revenue as a result. So we're sort of in a lose-lose situation, but there's no doubt that it's not like another department where we're just losing service. We're actually losing the ability to defend the city as well, and so that may be a choice that actually costs us money.
Yes, but at the same time, furloughs have much the same effect because we still have fewer attorneys on the ground, fewer attorney hours as a result of furloughs. So again, it's not a choice between a good option and a bad option. They're both bad options. So.
And to put it in context, the potential liability on this case is having to pay back 3 years' worth of furlough wages retroactively to the city attorneys. And so, the recommendation to end the program in January is in part to help mitigate that potential liability.
We'll talk about
Yeah.
that further in the
Right.
context of the discussion about the litigation, I think. But I
We don't hold.
I understand that that's the claim. I'm sorry, did you want to?
No, that's fine. You made the point that I was going to address.
I do want to say also, I guess, as long as we're spitballing this a little bit, that for the longer haul, I'm not signaling my pass here or anything, but just for the longer haul, if there were a longer-term view of this, if there is a need to realize savings, layoffs as a general matter achieve greater savings than an equivalent amount of furloughs do. Because, first of all, they're, of course, structural, but also because you have indirect costs of employees that are saved, that are expended, even though an employee is furloughed. So if you take the total number of attorney hours lost and the total amount of dollars in the pocket to our city attorneys lost, they would be less with layoffs than they would be with furloughs, although obviously the people laid off are significantly, worse, have a significantly worse impact. So I just want to put that out. The math is such that, furloughs and layoffs of equivalent number of hours are not equivalent.
I agree. I can personally attest to the fact that there are other alternatives, and I've taken a reduction and am making continuing sacrifice that pretty much arrives at the same amount.
Yeah.
And the CAO is very much aware of that.
So we'll have a continuing discussion about this. I, very much invite the CAO and the City Attorney's Office and the CLA to continue in this discussion, of which I'm eager to be a part, and we'll try to continue to work on where we can realize savings. But for the moment, at least pending our discussion tomorrow, it's my suggestion that we submit this without recommendation with regard to the layoffs. Is that okay? So without objection, that'll be the action of the committee on that item. All right, thank you all very much.
Thank you.
And that brings us to fire.
Be nice to me.
Always. I give you shout out.
It may be appropriate now to say good evening. So thank you for your patience in waiting it out. I think all of us had questions on fire. Mr. Kretz, do you have anything for the department? Or?
Yeah, I just want a sense of how much we've restored in terms of services and how short we are in achieving the level of service that we had prior to the recession.
I think your question really relates to whether the department has had the opportunity to add resources to the current budget. The answer to that is no, we have not. That certainly is something that the fire chief will be pursuing for next year's budget. As the CAO has indicated in his FSR, the department unfortunately is projecting a $5.2 million deficit through the end of this fiscal year. However, the fire chief is pursuing revenue opportunities. An example of that is that the fire chief was able to get agreement from both the mayor as well as the executive director of Water and Power to reimburse the department for fire services related to down power lines as well as shared hydrants. So we anticipate that reimbursement would total about $3 million. Another opportunity is the recent adjustment that the council had approved for special services fees, and with the implementation of that beginning November 1st, for the remainder of this fiscal year, we anticipate that those revenues would amount to something like $600,000. Finally, unfortunately, the implementation of the 40-hour work schedule in the dispatch center has been delayed, but we are working toward being able to implement that in the beginning of January. So assuming that starting in January or sometime during the first quarter of the calendar year, that could realize savings of approximately $1 million to $1.5 million. So any additional shortfall, we would adjust through other expenditures within the department.
Well, that was good information. I'm not sure it answered my exact question, though. How close are we to being an optimally functioning department again? And how much more would it cost us to reach that point?
Well, I think that the problem is that I think your question relates to how many additional positions need to be restored in order to get back to the level prior to the modified coverage plan. Is that your question?
Yes, or at least to the point, there may be some efficiencies that have been implemented so that not every single position might still be necessary. I don't know that. But to get to the point where we were as functional as we were at that point, how much more money would that cost us?
I think the CAO has an estimate of that.
I'm not going to say I have an estimate of that. I believe that the fire department was directed as part of the budget to come back with a 3 to 5 year plan on the restoration of services. And my understanding that is probably in the works, but we don't have a dollar amount on what restoration would be at this time. And quite frankly, with the $17 million shortfall that we're projecting for the current year citywide, it would be very hard to throw more resources at fire at this time.
Right. It would just be useful to know, because I don't think we were necessarily ready to get there, but it would be good to have a roadmap of what a fully functioning department would look like.
Well, I think
because without that roadmap, I don't think we know where we're ultimately trying to be headed, even if it's not going to be this year.
If I could weigh in on that as well, because the RFP is actually sitting on my desk, and it's almost done. But we did approve and appropriate enough funds to put together that plan. We've got an RFP going out on the street, I think, in the next couple weeks with the CAO. That's what we did the budget process, to come up with a full working model and plan of what you're asking for, and way beyond, in fact. So that's almost done and going out the door.
Well, the RFP was not really about how to restore services, but looking
You don't have components in that.
It might have components in it, but it was really looking at best practices, ways that we could more efficiently deploy within the fire department overall, options for looking at different ways of delivering service. And that RFP, yes, should go out in the next week to 2 weeks.
Yeah, but that answers those questions.
Yeah, that would ultimately answer the question.
Mr. Linder. All right, thanks. Just a couple quick little things. And thanks for your patience in sticking this out today as well. On the, you'd mentioned on the dispatch centers, on the 540, it's not yet implemented, and it's costing us $266,000 a month. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct, sir.
And do we know what the delay is in implementing?
Fundamentally, there were a couple of reasons. The primary reason is that when the dispatch center was moved to the P4 in City Hall East to the EOC, the department experienced some significant instability within the system, which I am told by our systems group is common for a system as complex as the CAD system that uses a combination of voice and data as well as being able to transmit part of its alerting system to the fire stations. And what that means is that once a system goes down, then the firefighters have to dispatch manually, And, certainly Chief Yamahata would be able to explain exactly what that means.
The 250,000 a month, I think we need a little more explanation on that, particularly since I'm notified as the chair of the committee when it is down, and it hasn't been down often or lately. But this is talking about a 540 work schedule as opposed to the technological problems we've experienced with the vendor that I've been assured have been fixed as well.
Well, the second component of the delay is the fact that if you convert from a platoon duty to a 40-hour work schedule, then that does require impact bargaining. And so the department has been engaged in impact bargaining with the union for several months. And we do anticipate that there is going to be some finalization of that process. And the chief's goal is to be able to implement that by the first quarter of the calendar year.
So we don't have an agreement for the 540 at this point? Is that correct? I didn't realize that was pending.
Yes, they have been engaged in negotiations for several months, as we indicate, and the recommendation for the staffing level is slightly different than what was recommended in the budget. The department is concerned about converting to 540, what that means relative to being able to address surge capacity, which is those events that are not planned, that require additional resources be available.
But is this stuck because of a meet and confer issue?
Well, the reason that I'm raising that point is that even though it's budgetary, it also means that the matter should be presented to the ERC because of the fact that there are budgetary implications and also impacts the negotiations. And so we have been working with the CAO and have informed the CAO that this issue will be presented to the ERC as soon as possible.
Well, the CAO's here. If we could ask him to come up real quick and speak on this. At $266,000 a month, we're talking about the 540 work schedule and why it hasn't been implemented yet on the dispatch systems and where things are stuck.
Yeah, as June stated, when we found out that it still hasn't been implemented, we want to make sure that it's done within the context of the rights that the city has. We believe that ultimately management has the authority to proceed forward with this change. We're simply negotiating the impacts of it. And so to reinforce that, we're taking it to ERC for discussion and approval.
Okay. My concern on this is we budgeted for an entire year of savings on this. We're just now learning in the FSR it hasn't been implemented because there's negotiating issues that weren't ever brought to our attention, but yet we realized an entire year of savings and it's still pending. So do we know what the time frame might be what do we think with certainty that we could get through this?
We're taking it to the next meeting of ERC, which is next week, for a discussion. And again, we feel that it is within the right of the department to implement it. And we're obligated to discuss the impacts of that, but that implementation should begin as soon as possible.
So assuming it comes to ERC and that's the determination, how quickly can the changes be made from the department?
I think, again, as June indicated, we're looking at the beginning of the year to try and implement it. It's not just something that you can turn a switch on. It has to be well planned out to go from a platoon duty work schedule to a 40-hour work week.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm still not certain I'm getting the right answers. If we've been planning this and it's been talked about and it was budgeted, quite frankly, I don't agree. And it's not brain surgery. And we've got people that can come in and do it for you if you can't figure it out yourself. But if it's costing us $266,000 a month, and this was budgeted for an entire year, I got a real problem with hearing that we can get this even resolved next week, but it's going to take you several months to get it implemented. That could have been worked on concurrently at the same time, so you could pull the trigger on it and implement from day one. And I'm still not buying it's the technology problem either. I'd like a full report on this immediately, and I'll schedule it. If we have to, we'll do a special public safety committee. It's too much money on the table. We were assured in this committee and budget, and we're looking at it from a budgetary perspective, but not to take time away from this committee. I think we need a full report on this immediately. And so we will have a special meeting on this. But it doesn't sound like we're getting the right answers out of, and perhaps you just don't know, and I don't fault you for that. There's other people, I'm sure, that are working on this as well. But I think we got to get more information back on this. It's too much money that there's no reason this hasn't been implemented. So I'll spend some time focusing on that in the next day. And then on the, my last question was just on the reappropriation. So it says to reapprove the use of 15 million in MICLA 14.9, and I'm not sure why we would have to reapprove and why that would be necessary to reapprove something that's already been approved. And this is on the acquisition of apparatus.
This is actually just a budget policy that was established a couple of years ago. We go through the budget process, we lay out, this is what's going to be planned purchases from LICLA, but there was instruction given from the committee to basically have all these things come back and just give a final approval, per se.
Oh, okay.
Thank you, Mr. Englander. Anything else? I feel very strongly that we need to move towards restoring our fire service. And I think that, 3 to 5 year plan is essential in that. And when we get to the point where we're out of the woods on this budgetary problem, in my view, the fire service is going to be the single most important priority for service restoration. At the same time, I want to, as diplomatically as I can, express my frustration at the fact that, again, similar to the conversation I had before, with every department suffering the cuts that they have, virtually all other departments, despite suffering those cuts, come back to us and cut services, do whatever they need to meet the budget that is provided to them by the council and the mayor. And we repeatedly have a challenge with fire in that regard. We repeatedly have this issue come up where there's a deficit that we learn about for the first time in the first FSR or in the second FSR or in the third FSR, and we're just expected to pay for it out of the reserve or something. We can't be in that situation. If there's going to be shortfalls, we need to know about it soon. We need to know about it early, not at the time of the first FSR when a quarter of our year is already gone. So I'm frustrated, especially because it's $11 million of the shortfall. It nets out at 5.2 projected deficit right now, but 11 million is in sworn constant staffing overtime account. That is imminently calculatable. We should know what that constant staffing cost is going to be, and we should be able to anticipate that. That's not an unanticipated expense that we should have to bear unless there's been a flurry of activities, that were unanticipated, some major catastrophe that I don't know about. Those are predictable expenses, and this committee needs to, and the council needs to know if the budget isn't being met. So, Mr. Englander, you mentioned the change in the dispatch staffing as well. It's a similar situation. This is something we should really be aware of if we budget for something that's going to realize millions of dollars, $3 million in savings, and then we lose a quarter of our year and realize that we're not yet ready to even start implementing that, even if it had been agreed to at this point. That's of significant concern. We're going to lose half a year of a $3.2 million savings. So I want to make as clear as I can how strongly I support the department, while still making clear that this process, this budgetary process, cannot stand. It cannot stand. This budget committee is going to be centrally involved in ensuring that every department meets its budget. And we're going to, if we're successful in doing that, hopefully sooner rather than later, we'll be able to start restoring services. But we can't have a situation where what we budget is just disregard it. And I don't say that lightly, but I mean, that the sense that I'm getting is when we continue to have these shortfalls, it's just telling me that as difficult as, I don't mean to minimize for a moment the difficulty of meeting inadequate budgets. Clearly it is. But if that is what we have, that is what we have, and we have to figure out how to operate in a way that is within that budget. So I'm going to ask, and if we have to make changes here because unanticipated expenses need to be addressed, then that's our job to do. But in order to do that job, we have to have constant flow of information about the status of budgets to this committee. And so I'm going to actually do you one better, Mr. Englander. I'm going to ask that we instruct the department between now and the mid-year FSR, that we instruct the department to report at each weekly meeting of the Budget and Finance Committee about the status of the sworn constant staffing overtime account, the status of the department's efforts to switch the dispatch shift to 540, and the status of the efforts to seek reimbursements under AB 678, which we described earlier as being absolutely time critical in order for us to realize $23 million in this fiscal year. So I believe we need to have at every weekly meeting of this committee, we need to have an update on those three items. If the update is there's no change, at least we know that. But sworn constant staffing overtime, the dispatch shift, and AB 678, I want, with your approval, absolutely, members, I want the fire department to report to us at every meeting between now and the FSR as to those three items.
Good idea.
So, and again, I say that with the full intention of trying to be helpful in ensuring that, you know, the department does get the resources that it needs, because clearly it is operating with inadequate resources now, and that's why we want to go to a multi-year vision with a multi-year model to try to begin restoring those services. But we have to do that based on the reality of what is available and what's being spent.
And as the chair of the Committee of Public Safety, we have it on a regular scheduled meeting where they come and report back on fire stat and all the changes. We've been through a lot of issues recently, as we all know, with the fire department. And most of that has been, quite frankly, not because of the men and women in the department, because the department has been decimated over the years.
Clearly.
And it's on a shoestring budget. And what we've done lately is we're trying to maintain the same practice that this culture of Cadillac treatment, that we have the best fire department in the entire country in the way to respond to emergencies and the way that we send the best and the brightest and the well-trained and with best equipment, and relooking at and retooling, not to lower that or diminish it, but focus on how can communication and dialogue enhance it and create those efficiencies, to focus on a lot of the issues with dispatch times and all the issues. We've had a lot of crises this year that have come to light, and with those surfacing, we're restructuring and working very closely with the department. That was part of the RFP issue that I talked about earlier as well. And so the financial issues are ripe to come back to this committee, and I do appreciate that. I think we have to focus on that because we have to start rebuilding the department correctly. And by doing that, it's by putting it, bringing it to the surface and recognizing it's the most important function is police and fire that we have in the city. And so we have to make sure that we fund it correctly, that we make the decisions correctly. We've spent over an hour today just talking about the civilian cuts in PD and what is that going to mean to officers on the street, and how is that, and those are the issues we have to talk about, if nothing else, and including the city attorney's office and the fact that they're our partner on the public safety side of it. We've spent a great deal of time today talking about that as well, so I appreciate your focus on this.
Thank you. And frankly, again, if we're aware of the reality of it, it also puts our larger budgetary discussion into a context too. If we know that we've budgeted a certain amount for the fire department, and even with that budgeted amount, they can't deliver services, they're going to have to spend more. That sends a message to everybody else as well of the degree of the crisis that we're facing. If we can't realize any more efficiencies, then it lets everybody know that we have to find other cuts or we have to find other revenues. There's no other way around it. So that's going to be the action of the committee with regard to the FSR and the fire department. We're going to add that instruction in as well. I don't want to say all that. I mean, you're free to respond or not. It doesn't, you can respond next time around, or it's up to you. I don't mean to make that sound as though, well, anyway, it is what it is. So we just need to have the information. So, okay, thank you very much.
So now, GSD.
This is going to seem tame by comparison to everything else, I think, but did anybody else have GSD? Yeah, go ahead.
I called it special. On just the fleet reduction, I think there was objectives, there were things made and goals set on fleet reduction that haven't been met, and I just wanted to get the status on. As the fleet is aging and we haven't reduced it, it requires more mechanics and more parts, and the price of gasoline that keeps going up to fuel these vehicles. Yet we've set an ambitious, or I shouldn't even say ambitious, but a reachable, obtainable goal in reduction. And I wanted to find out where we're at in our fleet reduction.
As you know, we brought in a consultant. Oh, I'm sorry, my name is Richard Colson, the Fleet Director, General Services, Fleet Services. We did bring in a consultant, and they identified 447 vehicles to be reduced from the fleet.
Okay.
And of those 447 vehicles, actually, we've collected so far 270.
When did they finish the report for the 447?
I think the report was completed in April of 2010, I think it was.
So what's taken so long to get rid of? We've only reduced 242, but they've identified 447. I don't understand why it would take over 2 years to...
Correct. Well, there's been some discussions with the departments. Some of the departments didn't necessarily agree with the vehicles that were identified, so there are ongoing discussions.
It's cars or people is where we're at.
Correct.
So
I agree.
Okay.
I agree.
So it's been a direction of the city that we need to reduce our fleet. We brought in a consultant that we paid, I don't know how much money, to say, get rid of them.
Correct.
Get rid of them. I don't want to be sitting here on another FSR to say, we've identified, we paid a consultant. How much money did we pay this consultant, by the way? Do we know?
Do you have a list of the departments?
Yes.
Well, in any event, I was just making a point.
But
So I
they
don't
have
think
the list of the departments, but maybe if they walk you through which ones they are.
Well, let's do that. But in 2010-11, so the parts account is what's really killing us, 2.9 million based on anticipated reductions of 2,000 vehicles, but we're not. So the other issue is we're budgeting towards the fleet reduction, we're budgeting towards less parts and maintenance, we're budgeting towards less mechanics, but we still have the cars.
That's
We're
correct.
budgeting towards less fuel because the reports have showed that we're going to get rid of almost 500 cars, but we haven't. We've only gotten rid of half of those. So, yeah, the list of departments are where.
But is the point, just so I'm clear on this, because there was an overrun in the parts budget. Is the reason for that because of the increased age of the fleet due to slower replacement schedule? And if so, how does that tie into an overall fleet reduction strategy?
Angela Sherrick by Department of General Services. You're correct, Councilmember. The age of the fleet has a great deal to do with the parts budget. The other thing is we've seen an increase in parts individually for vehicles over the last several years. So all of that plays a role in the fact that we have a deficit in the parts account. One of the things that we are doing, though, is meeting with special funded departments to determine if they are paying the amount that they should be paying with respects to the maintenance that we're providing. And so that is one of the ways that we're actually looking at trying to reduce the deficit that we have in the parts account right now. But to address your question, Councilmember Englander, one of the things that we've also done is meet with the mayor's office. And the mayor's office has been instrumental in helping us actually take some of the vehicles out of the departments because one of the concerns that the departments have is that as soon as they give up the vehicles, then they're going to have a difficulty providing the service. And so we've met with the mayor's office, and so while you see that we've received about 270 vehicles, we also have made some arrangements with some of the departments, which will mean that they will actually pay for the maintenance of the vehicles that they're keeping. So we will actually, our revised number is about 375 vehicles that we will,
I'm sorry, when you say they've made arrangements to take care of the...
to pay for the maintenance for the vehicles that they're going to be
That means
keeping.
them coming back to this committee or to council and asking for more money for their departments to take care of those vehicles?
No. The mayor's office, the department, and general services have met, and they have determined that they have funding in their budgets already. So most of the departments that are actually doing that are small number
It all
of
comes
people.
out of the same source. So at the end of the day, to me, it just, with all due respect, and I don't mean it on you, I mean it on the departments that are playing a shell game, which is really what it was. I mean, well, we'll keep the vehicles, but we'll keep them and absorb them with our budget. We're budgeting them. We're giving this department the budget when we brought in an independent consultant to actually weed out the fleet we don't need, particularly the aging ones that are causing us more heartache and money. So do we have a list of, is it in here? I'm not sure if it's in here.
She has it.
Oh, you've got a copy of the list of the departments?
I do have a list of the departments. We can report back to you, or would you like to see this now, or how would you like to?
You can report it back to us. If we can get a copy, this is coming tomorrow anyway, so if you can bring a copy tomorrow, I don't know that we'll bring it up in council, but I'd like to see it. And let me ask you this question. Let me ask it a different way. What can we do to help you? What can we do to go to these departments and say, look, we've identified this aging fleet, we can't maintain anymore. We brought in an independent consultant that says, you don't need them anymore. And they came up with different factors and reasons why. Yes, they want to keep them, of course. And they're saying they can absorb them in their departments. The same thing. We fund the departments. It all comes out of, it's either going to be people or these vehicles at the end of the day.
That's correct. One of the things that
So what can we do?
we did when we brought the consultant in, and they identified 477, that's a much lower number than the 2,000 that was actually taken out of the budget. But again, one of the things that we did to help us take the vehicles out of the fleet was to meet with the mayor's office, and they actually met with the department. So they revised the number has been revised down from 477 to 375, and we believe now that we'll get all those vehicles, the whole 375. The departments that have not turned in the vehicles, haven't turned in all of the vehicles, are Rec and Parks. However, we've had many discussions with them, and they will be turning them in before the end of the fiscal year. So all of the departments have really complied based on the revised numbers, either meeting with the mayor's office or turning them in by the end of the fiscal year with that revised number of 375.
Why don't we just do this? Can we include an update on the next FSR with a little more detail?
Sure.
And the departments?
Good.
Maybe that's just the way to do it. It sounds like you're aggressive. And great, so I appreciate it. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much. Okay, I think that's it for the department.
So that was it for the departments. I didn't know if the committee had any questions on any of the non-departmental information.
I do have a few others that I wanted to cover. There are a number of recommendations in the FSR for general fund reimbursement of special funds, stormwater, pollution abatement, with regard to Operation Healthy Streets, and a number of others. I'm wondering if are those, Operation Healthy Streets being a good example, it seems to me that that's an appropriate use of stormwater pollution abatement funds, and I'm wondering, first of all, why there needs to be a reimbursement, and has your office confirmed as to these other reimbursements that there isn't at least an arguable claim that the original expenditure is an appropriate use of the funds? I mean, what without getting into the gross details of this particular case, I mean, that is actually a stormwater pollution abatement that was entered into. So why isn't it coming out of those funds?
That's where we start. That's a good example. We try to maximize the special funds within sort of the restrictive nature of those funds, and the reimbursement is not a full reimbursement of the activity that was done. It's a partial, but the final number is based on the department's determination of what's actually ineligible. as for that specific activity that was done. So the number would have been much higher if we hadn't gone through that process initially, but that is part of the initial steps that we go through. We were hoping when we first started Operation Safety Streets not to have any general fund contribution, but it wasn't feasible because some of the activity that was done really isn't eligible.
Okay. Well, and then conversely, we've approved a number of settlements in recent months where we've tried to change the direction to the city attorney to ensure that the settlement is paid out of the Stormwater Pollution Abatement Fund. But we've also had others where it seemed like it might have been, but it was not. So I wonder if there is an opportunity to offset some of that reimbursement by providing for reimbursement to the city's liability fund from the Stormwater Pollution Abatement Fund for some of those expenditures that have already been made.
From a specific settlement from the, we did look at that. There was a specific settlement that we examined initially to help actually cover some of the Healthy Streets program. And again, because the dollars went straight to the special funds based on the regulations pertaining to that, the same issue still applied. It couldn't, we narrowed down as much as possible the ineligible portion of that activity so that the general fund hit was as small as possible. So that would have applied as well with any settlement.
And one thing, like particularly for the stormwater pollution abatement, that's a very constrained fund. We used existing budgeted dollars to cover this expense. We could conceivably say, yes, it could continue to cover the expense, but then there are things that you budgeted for that will not get done this year because we don't have any extra real savings within the stormwater pollution abatement fund. And so
There's just a finite amount of money available this year. That's what it boils down to.
But we always start off with
But
that.
my priority is the general.
No, and it's always mine, trust me. So that's why we start off.
We're very worried about it as well. So.
That's what we always start off saying, how much could we squeeze out of the special funds? And then finally, then the final reimbursement gets down to either it's completely ineligible because of the actual activity that was done, or we maxed out on how much special funds we could squeeze out. But that's really sort of the first step that we go through.
Okay. Well, I'd like to kind of take another look on that whether the liability fund might be able to be reimbursed for some of stormwater-related cases that we haven't already thought of doing that through claims fund or this.
And I have to say, when we, back in April when we budgeted, yes, we squeeze every dollar we can. But that's not to say there aren't opportunities as we progress through the fiscal year that there's additional savings that we could use for any potential settlements that come through the process. So.
Now, related to that, we've already spent 40% of our liability fund as of the first FSR. Is that an unusual blip? Is it something that we should be concerned about running that account dry in mid-year? Any thoughts on how big of a concern that should be?
I would say I think it is a concern. We are certainly burning through the dollars a bit faster than normal. We've had a number of large settlements have come through the process for approval. Certainly, we're going to continue to work with the city attorney to monitor the cases. We'll be asking them as far as what they think the timing is for potential settlement or judgment on those. If we get later in the year, what can happen is the city attorney will structure settlements that perhaps will roll into the following fiscal year. So, but we'll continue to look at.
Great.
Actually, a weird question on that particular account. Is that account on a cash or accrual? Is it based on when we receive the judgment or enter into the settlement, or?
As far as the actual dollars, it's cash.
It's all cash.
It's budgeted every year.
Yeah, it's budgeted every year, but I mean, when we get the snapshot on the FSR, for example, is it like if we just had a judgment against us 2 weeks ago, would it be reflective if it hadn't been paid out yet?
It would be reflected if we knew of it, yes.
If we knew of it.
Yes.
So it's accrual, it's not truly cash. It's if there are pending judgments, we just haven't, because we don't process checks very quickly here. So.
Well, one thing, actually, when we, our staff prepares sort of a chart on basically all the approved settlements plus pending ones that will be in committee or actually might be, that we're, bless you, that we might know that are in claims board, but we really don't go farther than that.
Right, so the ones that we have substantive knowledge that they're going to be paid in the near future.
Okay, so we get
And
the
we have
snapshot
a-
after all, so it's very conservative. I mean, it includes,
I mean, ideally, there's as few surprises as possible. So if it's in the final phases of the settlement process, or claims board, or it's gone through your primary committee, then we assume it in the.
Yeah, but again, this is another area where, you know, there is great potential for surprise, and maybe I just don't know what happens between your office and the city attorney, but to what extent is the city attorney's office providing updated status reports about risks of their pending litigation? I mean, any business that has a lot of litigation would have regular reports that lists the pending cases, lists the risk allocation for those cases, and the range of potential damages that might be incurred.
Right.
That would be a part of your SEC reporting. It would be, I mean, you would always have some kind of risk assessment of every pending case. And I'm wondering to what extent that analysis fits into our budget.
We actually have to do that as part of our Exhibit A when we issue our debt. So we have a very extensive exhibit that talks about the state of the city's finances, and there's a very elaborate section on pending litigation that we actually work with the city attorney on that walks through any major cases and the status of those cases and the potential liability to those cases. So,
But my recollection of that is that it's like maybe the 4 or 6 mega cases that are kind of the ones that would blow up the whole budget.
Right.
It's not a comprehensive list of, you know, we've got all of these
Right.
cases, and this is what the attorney who's handling the case believes the likely outcome is, and right? I mean, are we doing that? Because as a matter of risk management, I would think that we need to have that we have to have the city attorney report to us in that level of detail. It doesn't have to be a discussion to be resolved today, but Mr. Englander's question, which is a very interesting one, it just sparked that. So we'll have a further discussion about how we can structure that.
If I may, I believe the city attorney actually reports normally quarterly on the status of pending litigation. I think probably you would behoove the committee to sort of have actually to schedule those and actually talk about some of those cases and actually timing. Usually what they do, they present the list. It didn't always have a sort of a risk assessment as far as timing, but I think it'd be good for the committee to sort of go through those and ask the city attorney some questions as far as when they think things will play out.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you. Anything else? I think I've just about exhausted my energy level. So anything further? All right. Well, let's see if we can kind of recapture the sentiment of what we've talked about. I think what I would recommend is to move the FSR with the amendments that are included in item number 2, which is before us, submitted by the CLA. And also with the addition that the report should reflect that the city attorney layoff section is submitted without recommendation.
Recommendation, I believe, 36, 37, and 38.
There were 3, yes. So I don't have it in front of me, but pending the results of the closed session discussion on the lawsuit regarding furloughs. The report, I would recommend, also should include an instruction for the CAO and the CLA to work with personnel as they compile the list of filled positions that would be eliminated according to the existing budget, and report with potential solutions to achieve a $40 million budget stabilization fund, and to the extent possible, preservation of filled positions after bumping has occurred to maintain current city services. To instruct the fire department to report to the Budget and Finance Committee on a weekly basis until the mid-year FSR is released on the following items: the status of the sworn constant staffing overtime account, the status of the department's efforts to switch the dispatch shift to 540, and the status of the efforts to seek reimbursements for Medi-Cal ambulance trips under AB 678. And with those, there's no objection to that. That will be the...
Chair, if I may respectfully, we do have two technical corrections. One on recommendation 1, basically revising a incorrect fund on attachment 4.
Hold on, let me get there.
It doesn't affect the actual dollar in the recommendation. It's just a fund number. Also, then on recommendation 2, because DOT had to have a motion to move some dollars, that the amount needs to be reduced by $2 million to reflect that action that was already approved by council. Okay, and we'll make sure the clerk has that. Yes.
Okay. All right, with those additions, then, that will be the action of the committee, and we thank you all very, very much for your patience and for your good work.
Okay, thank you.
And we are adjourned.